Ms. Kamish Ahmed, I just want to check if we are recording and if we're online. Okay, I see a thumbs up. There's a bit of an echo. Okay. Colleagues, I'm just going to quickly mute everyone. Okay. Welcome everyone today to the Budget Committee. My name is Deirdre Bartman. I'm chairperson of the committee. Today we are going to be receiving a briefing by the Provincial Treasury on the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook, the Western Cape Adjustments Appropriation Bill 2021, the 2021-2022 second quarter performance, financial and non-financial, financial and non-financial, the medium-term budget policy statement. We will then be considering and adopting the draft committee report on the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook 2021. We will then consider for adoption a draft committee minutes, and then we'll have resolutions and actions. As we begin, I'm going to ask that in terms of the quarter 2 outcomes, the financial and non-financial, that Provincial Treasury just please do that particular presentation at the end, so that we deal with the MERO as well as the adjustment budget at the same time, given that it was tabled at the same time as well. But with that, I'm going to first ask members to introduce themselves, and then I'm going to ask the Minister and his delegation to introduce themselves, and if the Minister has any remarks, and we're going to jump straight into the presentation, and then there'll be space for questions and answers as well afterwards. But with that, I'm also just going to put my video off, just for connectivity purposes. Thank you so much. Members, you may now introduce yourselves.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Lorraine Botha.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Chair Khalil Brankais.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairperson Khalid Sayed.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Matlodi Maseko.
Good afternoon, Chair Wendy Kaiser-Philanda.
Good afternoon, Chair Ricardo Mackenzie.
Thank you.
Goedemiddag, Regan Allen.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair.
Thank you. I heard members America and Van der Westhuizen at the same time there. Thank you. Okay, if there are no other members. Okay, Minister, I'm going to then hand over for you for introduction with your delegation and some introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I think I spent quite some time this morning setting the scene in the medium-term budget policy statement, and I don't think that there's much to add. Perhaps we should note, of course, that this meeting is a slight outlier, because this morning, of course, we tabled the 2021 Municipal Economic Review and Outlook, which we will obviously present and deliberate on today. Other than that, I obviously look forward to the presentations and then the engagement and discussions with honourable members of your committee. With that, can I hand to David Savage, the Provincial Head of Treasury, to introduce himself and the team. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Good morning, Chairperson, and good morning to all the honourable members. Yes, as the Minister said, I'm David Savage, Head of the Provincial Treasury, and I'm joined by a full team from the Treasury here today, including both Deputy Director Generals, Ms. Julinda Gantana and Dr. Roy Haberman, Ms. Annelies Peck, our Chief Director, Provincial Government Public Finance, as well as her team, Mr. Malcolm Boyson, our Acting Chief Director, Public Policy Services, Mr. Stephen Kenyon, our Chief Director for Local Government, and colleagues, please excuse me if I've forgotten any other, well, I'm not mentioning any other names of Provincial Treasury officials, but I know that they will both be here and watching on the stream as well. Chairperson. Before I hand over to the team to take us through the various documents that were tabled by the Minister and covered in his speech today, I thought I should just outline the way in which we propose to approach all of these documents, just so that there is sufficient time, I think, for the committee to consider and ask questions on each of the documents. We're going to start out with a very brief overview of the MERO and then suggest coming back to it after having covered the medium-term budget policy statement and the 2021 adjustments budget. That's because the MERO in itself is a substantive document, but it is tied into the broader budget process. So we thought to do it justice while keeping enough of a focus on the medium-term budget policy statement, we would come back to it in more detail, and then, as you'd suggested, Chair, also then end up with the Q2 financial and non-financial performance report, which is a somewhat briefer affair. Chair, if I may then continue and dive straight into the session. What the Minister had tabled today in the legislature and in the form of the medium-term budget policy statement and the adjustments estimates was the outcome of quite extensive engagements that really make up the second phase of the budget process, that we have a three-stage budget process that we follow every year. The first phase of that were really framed by our medium-term budget policy committee meetings in government and the tabling of the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook, which was tabled in the legislature in September. The medium-term budget policy statement and adjustments budget are really then phase two, which follow extensive technical engagements as well as engagements at executive level in the medium-term expenditure policy committee that lead to the 2021 adjusted budget allocations and the preliminary allocations for the 2022 MTEF. And it is in March that we will come back to the legislature with the detailed proposals for the 2022 MTEC and more extensive documentation around the spending plans over the new medium-term expenditure framework. So the medium-term budget policy statement is really the moment to lay out the core, the headline objectives and intentions of the 2022 medium-term expenditure framework. And those details then are filled in between now and March. The budget, as the Minister had mentioned, is really a budget to back you, which is really enabling the Western Cape to be ready to reopen and recover. So these were themes that were developed in the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook in extremely uncertain and challenging times and are now being sustained through the budget process. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the key messages that the Minister had laid out are in his speech, and I won't do as fine a job as he did. Were really around the significant fiscal constraints that we face at this time, the budget crunch, and the significant fiscal risks that we therefore face over the medium term. And there are a number of uncertainties that still exist in the fiscal framework that we will chisel away at between now and March in order to provide greater certainty over the medium term. This is not unusual that there would be uncertainty at this time in the medium-term framework, in the development of the medium-term framework, but we are, as members will know, at a time of heightened uncertainty. The emergence of the Omicron variant and its sudden shock that had to economic activity, particularly in our tourism industry, were things that only really started to materialize last weekend, the weekend before the one we've just concluded. The We are still coping with significant uncertainties, but I think that we are well positioned to do so, and part of the presentation will explain why. As the Minister had said, the MTBPS is positioning the Western Cape to be ready to reopen and recover, and a budget that really is aimed at backing businesses, families in the Western Cape to recover from the consequences of the pandemic. Over the medium term, budget policy priorities are to ensure an ongoing effective response to the pandemic, to support the recovery plan, support our frontline services, drive infrastructure delivery, strengthen municipal support and oversight, ensure value for money in provincial expenditures, strengthen our procurement practices and transparency in procurement, and effectively mitigate risks, particularly risks around and uncertainties over the medium term. The medium-term budget policy statement itself is divided into 4 chapters: an overview chapter, which also covers the economic context, a Western Cape fiscal strategy chapter, which also has advanced information in this version on risk management and mitigation, a fiscal framework chapter, and a budget policy priorities chapter. So with that, I'll hand over to Dr. Haverman, who will start to take us through the economic and fiscal context leading to the medium-term budget policy statement, and I think he'll obviously hand over to his team as needed in that, and we will then move to the adjustments estimates. Thank you.
Thank you very much, HOD, and good afternoon, Chair, and good afternoon, members and colleagues. So I think, as we all know, the South African economic situation remains constrained. On the left-hand side there, what we have is a graph of South African GDP, and you'll see that it shows a sharp decline in GDP in the second quarter of 2020, and then to some extent a recovery in 2020 quarter 3 back to 2020 quarter 4. But the problem is that that employment has not recovered at the same rate as GDP has recovered. So there's been a lagged recovery in employment, and obviously the most recent employment numbers have shown quite worrying, substantial rise in unemployment in the third quarter. Similarly, the Western Cape is on the right-hand side, and that shows a similar picture, which is that although GDP has begun to recover, which is good news, employment has not recovered as quickly. That said, really the way forward in terms of getting the economy moving again is obviously vaccinations, and 4.2 million vaccinations have been administered in the Western Cape, and this is sort of a number that rises every day. So we're trying to keep it as up-to-date as possible, over 50% of the population. On the following slide, we talked a little bit to one of the components of our analysis. So you remember, the committee will remember that we tabled the PERO, which gives an outline of the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook and sort of the situation at the provincial level. Today, obviously, we tabled the brother or the sister publication, which is the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook, and it goes into detail at a district-by-district level into what we know about the districts and how they are developing. As the HOD said in his introduction, we're going to do a detailed presentation on that after this presentation, but just to give you a taste of what is contained in the mirror this year, a district-by-district level, and also this is a very important publication as part of our overall evidence-led based approach to planning, because this will feed directly into the integrated development plans that the municipalities each have to draw up during the course of the coming years as they move into the new councils. On the following slide, so what we've really been thinking about is what are the policy implications of both the PERO and the MERO, and how do we use this in our planning process, particularly over the medium term. I think really the big thing that comes out from the MERO in terms of what we need to think about is this obviously rapid population growth, which creates rising services demand, particularly in urban areas, increased volatility in the short term, but and a projected slowdown in the medium term. So that's also because COVID has had very interesting implications for how people move around, also very interesting implications for how people use services. So, for example, parents who put their children into schools near where they live now, where they work, now don't travel into work often, and so now they can't actually use schools near to where they work, and that creates a lot of disruptions for many parents across the entire province. And part of that really is our shift towards a joint district and metro approach, which is to move towards thinking about one plan between the national government, the provincial government, and the local governments. The mirror also highlights our comparative advantages, one of them obviously being food and beverages, but we'll go into a lot of detail about unemployment rates, household income, and infrastructure investment in the province. But all of these are things that we have taken into account in developing the ideas for the M2US and the MTEF. On the following slide, this really speaks directly to our response and how we're thinking through the response of the province. So one of the innovations in the M2PS this year is we've introduced a more detailed risk statement where we've looked at global risks, national risks, and provincial risks, and then we've identified how can we respond as a provincial government to these risks. So I won't go into the detail of every single global risk, but I think there's some really important ones just to pull out. Geopolitically, there's been a collapse of multilateralism, which what that really means is it's more and more difficult to coordinate the world. The rise of social media and different political parties around the world really creates a lot of geopolitical issues. State collapse in certain countries abroad, terrorist attacks and weapons of mass destruction. These are sort of the usual global risks in terms of geopolitics. Obviously, there are economic risks, social risks, technological risks, and quite importantly for the Western Cape, environmental risks around long-term climate events. These are the top global risks identified by the World Economic Forum, which we've used as part of our risk strategy for the province. In terms of national risks, this comes from the Institute of Risk Management of South Africa. Really, if you look at all those bullets, I think the real issue that comes out there is governance, which is the need to improve governance, leadership, public governance failures, corruption, etc. But then also issues around inequality, education and skills development, and then again, climate change, and so forth. So these are the sort of global and national risks. These are not economic risks or fiscal risks. These are just sort of broad risks. And then what you do is you take those risks and you sort of boil them down into what will actually have fiscal implications, i.e. what the Treasury, National Treasury and the Provincial Treasury need to respond to. And the National Treasury has identified macroeconomic risks, spending risks, risks around contingent and accrued liabilities, and the sustainability of social expenditure. So these are all the things that we've spoken about before, declining growth, interest and exchange rates. So for example, we're entering an interest rate upward cycle of the interest rate. And as we've highlighted before in presentations to the committee, debt to GDP is very, very high. On the expenditure risk side, the impact of the cuts to compensation are very serious for the province, as is national household insurance, and the expenditure risk posed by subnational governments themselves, because subnational governments like the province have to implement a lot of the services on behalf of the government generally. Around contingent and accrued liabilities, there the risks are well known. There definitely are government guarantees, particularly the big state-owned enterprises like Eskom and so forth, and SANRAL and SAA, and then of course the financial position of these state-owned entities, Eskom being the really, really big one. And then finally, the sustainability of social expenditure, particularly there the demographic changes are the ongoing population growth without necessarily having sufficient resources to meet that. And that really goes to the bottom right hand there about the national fiscal risk directly impacting the Western Cape fiscal framework, because the province is dependent on most of its revenue from national government. And I'll speak a little bit to that in a moment. Then on the following slide, these are just the risks that have been identified at a provincial level around cybersecurity, values and behaviors, fiscal pressures, safety, well-being, jobs, and climate change. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. I'd rather get into how we speak about our response. And this slide talks to, you take all those risks, you take all those considerations, and you think about how does one actually practically deliver on a budget that works. And as the Minister says, it's a budget to back you. And what we've done there is identified 4 principles on which the budget is built. The first one is protecting basic services outcomes in line with the recovery plan. The second one is strengthening allocative efficiency. What we mean there is how do we actually allocate money in the most efficient way across different votes. Principle 3 is enhancing productive efficiency. So how do we get the best out of what we have available? And then 4th principle is obviously enabling long-run fiscal sustainability, because we must make sure the decisions we take today are the correct ones in the long run. And these are given very practical effect through a set of budget objectives, which have really guided the development of the MTBS and the M2S framework. And that is to prioritize the fight against COVID. So that talks directly to protecting basic services, including the successful rollout of the vaccination program. We need to also support the recovery plan priorities of job safety and well-being. We need to protect frontline services, including education, health and social development. Support effective local governance, particularly in the aftermath of the local government elections. We need to make sure that we rebalance expenditure as far as possible to things that are going to be good for us in the long run, particularly infrastructure. Improve the efficiency of expenditure by driving value for money, promoting the transparency of expenditure, mitigating risks, and ensuring long-run sustainability. So you can think about the ones on the right-hand side as sort of giving practical effect to those 4 big principles. On the following slide, this really just speaks to how the 2021 M2S responds, particularly to one of those things, which is around the recovery plan of COVID recovery, jobs, safety, and well-being. I think it's very important, just before I go on, and this is something that my team knows I'm quite passionate about, which is that we often think that some of the solutions to our problem are often fiscal, that we need to spend more. Sometimes non-fiscal responses are just as important, which is actually to spend, not only to spend more, but also to make the right policies. And we'll speak a little bit about that when we talk about the recovery plan, which is what are the things that we can do that don't require money, and how can we actually drive economic growth and development through things that don't require money. And simple things like there are ease of doing business, which will make it easier for people to invest in the province. That doesn't necessarily require additional resources. What it requires us to do is actually just have better and simpler processes. So that sometimes the answer is not always money, particularly in a constrained fiscal environment. That's quite important. On the following slide, this just sort of talks to how we have thought about these recovery plan priorities. So when the Minister is talking about a budget that backs the citizen and a budget that backs you, and really talks to those points about job safety, well-being, we've thought quite long and hard about what are the specific things that we can do under each of those areas. And the Minister will say that he really likes us to think about the big things that can be done, not what he calls the pea shooters, which are small things, but the big things that can be done under each of those objectives, and how can we drive job safety and well-being in the province. So the MTF budget responds to many of these things, scaling up work opportunities and skills. We'll talk a little bit about how we do that through, for example, the teaching assistance program, boosting investment, developing economic resilience, boosting infrastructure, and as I was talking about, ease of doing business. And the safety, we'll talk a little bit about the substantial additional resources that are allocated to the safety priority of the MTF, particularly to make sure that we enhance and drive the LEAP program, and make improvements on the social safety cluster, but also things we'll do to improve urban design, because a lot of things that can be done in urban design improve safety. And then on the well-being thing, obviously the very big one there is COVID and responding to the COVID crisis. but also there's a related increase in need for allocating resources to mental health, because that has really developed as a sort of an outcome of both the COVID crisis, because of what's happened to people's livelihoods, but also what has happened in their social structures. And then this idea of the enabler is the things that are done as a province to deliver on those job safety and well-being things. So integrated service delivery, governance, talent and staff development, innovation, and a citizen-centric culture. On the following slide. So yeah, one of the really big things that has come out of the process is the need for us to manage wage pressure. So that is around the compensation of employees. And I'm going to ask my colleague, Ms. Annelies Pick, to talk through a little bit about how we've thought through the differentiated approach on COE and how we are implementing a lot of the risks related to compensation, because it certainly is one of the key risks facing the province.
Thank you, Roy. So in terms of how we've managed the wage bill in the province, is that this has come over time, as we all do know. I mean, we've been very prudent in our decision making regarding COE, regarding having ceilings on COE in previous years. So how we are doing this in terms of going forward is that we're maintaining the pressure on COE, and that is to avoid the crowding out of service delivery in terms of COE crowding out other expenditure items and the ability to deliver other services. We are looking at no increasing in the COE establishments unless there is a policy decision to do so, there's additional functions that have been given to departments, or that there has been a change in the mandate of a particular department. Departments are also being asked to adopt the COE in a more conservative fashion, and they need to explain and come with a COE strategy within the PGM Tech 2. Further on, in terms of COE, it's not only about controlling the wage bill, but it's also about making sure that we are building capacity within the province, and that we're making sure that our staff is capable in order to produce the services that we need to produce in the most efficient manner. Then also in terms of the way we've applied COE in the current financial year, and I'll speak about this really when we get to the adjustments budget, is the fact that we took a differentiated approach in terms of funding the wage agreement in this adjustments budget, and we made sure that our frontline services are protected, as they are the headcount heavy departments in terms of providing services. Then also that we, in terms of the baselines for the MTF to come, and we have made sure that we have not allocated the wage component right now as this part of the budget process, but more at the end of the budget process, we will then be looking at in terms of the needs of the department around COE, and therefore in terms of also taking the outlook into consideration, and then in terms of putting that together as our final allocations. Thank you, Roy.
Thanks very much, Annelies. And Annelies will talk a little bit in more detail about that when we talk about the adjustments budget and how we've dealt with, which is a very important risk and a very important issue. So then to come back to the preliminary budget, and what I'm going to talk to now is all those risks, how they actually materialize in numbers, and what the implication is on the province, and how then we respond to that. So as we all know, the National Treasury really is following an approach of a significant fiscal consolidation, and their members will know the slide from previous presentations. The idea there really is that what they're trying to do is that dark red line, which is to reduce the percent of GDP in terms of non-interest expenditure. because clearly what has happened over the past number of financial years is that there has been a significant increase in spending from about 24% of GDP to 26% of GDP. Obviously, in the last financial year, a lot of that was COVID, and so that will naturally go away. But there has been this long-run upward trend in spending to GDP, partly as a result of compensation pressures. And so that really is the strategy, is to reduce that. And so at the same time, the hope is that revenue to GDP will bounce back, and all the indications are that it will be bouncing back. And then over time, the fiscal consolidation will basically be a combination of bringing non-interest expenditure down as a percentage of GDP and rising the grey line revenue, and that will cause sort of a closing of the famous hippopotamus mouth, which is that big open jaw, and that will allow, because as we know, if spending comes down and your revenue goes up, then the amount of debt that you have to take on every year comes down, and so that will allow debt to GDP to stabilize over the MTEF. Of course, the big thing that happens there is that there are cuts that are pushed throughout the system, and a large amount of those cuts are actually imposed on the province, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. In the bottom right-hand box, is the things that Annalise has just spoken about, which is this major uncertainty around conditional grants, which we still haven't got the final allocations yet. But secondly, major uncertainties around the 2018 wage agreement, which is still under litigation, and some uncertainty about the interpretation and rollout of the 1.5% adjustment. So civil servants got two things in the most recent wage agreement. The one was 1,000 Rand for the lowest levels, rising 1,000, a little bit more for each level up, which is approximately 5% of the total wage bill, and then an additional 1.5% adjustment. But that the way National has allocated this to the provinces, and I'll speak to that in a moment, hasn't been exactly clear about how they're going to deal with the possible wage pressures in 22-23 and in 23-24. And so a lot of policy uncertainty remains around compensation. On the following slide, this is just a repeat of the slide we had before, just talking about the budget policy principles. If we go to the following slide, this tries to take that closing of the hippopotamus mouth and how it's been applied to the province. So the top line there, the provincial equitable share as per the 2021 MTEF allocation letter, is the provincial equitable share that we got in the last MTEF, which is 54.8 billion, 55.3, 57.8 billion. What has happened is that there have been adjustments to the baseline for two reasons. The first is new data updates in the provincial equitable share formula, and those have been positive for us, and those are things like faster population growth, increase in learner numbers, etc. And so there have been some increases in allocations to the province in 22-23. However, there have been other changes to the provincial equitable share, and we go into quite a lot of detail that in the MTBS documentation. We will give you a comprehensive summary of the changes on the health portion of the formula, and we can talk to that in more detail at a later stage or now if the committee is interested. But what that means is that there is basically a reallocation of money from the urbanized provinces to the less urbanized provinces for healthcare, and that means that the Western Cape and Gauteng both have reductions in their provincial equitable share in 23-24 and 24-25. And the reductions in the provincial equitable share there are 300 on total. If you add back the amounts that are added to the provincial equitable share from the population growth numbers, and you deduct the amounts due to the health changes, the net effect is 305 million in 23-24 and 264.6 million in 24-25. So that gives us a revised provincial equitable share of 54.905, 55.084 and 57.613 over the MTEF. So that deals with sort of the baseline provincial equitable share. Then on the following line, what we've done there is shown how National has allocated the wage agreement to the province. So members will remember that there was a wage freeze, and then, as I said, people at level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, etc., at the lower levels of the civil service, they got R1,000, and then I think 1,100, and so forth up the chain. And what has happened is that has meant that there has been an increase in wages, a wage bill for the province in both this financial year and in next financial year. And the impact of that in the province is an additional 1.453 billion in 22-23. Members will notice that there is no money allocated for wages in 23-24 and 24-25. There are some indications that National's view is that they're waiting to understand more about the wage agreement, but essentially there's a lot of uncertainty about how much money the province will be allocated in 23-24 and 24-25. Which is why Annelies was talking about that differentiated approach and how we think very, very carefully about the wage allocations in those 2 years. If you then add those up, so in 23-22, if you add up the 54,905 to the 1,453, then you get to the provincial equitable share allocations in for the 22 MTEF. And those percentages there on the line above the grey, that's just the share that the Western Cape gets of the national pie. And you see it's going up very, very slowly over the MTEF. And that gives us sort of the base for provincial equitable share. On the following slide, so that's the provincial equitable share. Then what you do need to do is add all the conditional grants that get allocated to the province. These are the indicative grant allocations. National departments must still finalize the final conditional grant allocations. There are some uncertainty about some of the grants, particularly the grants in healthcare, because we're actually got a big meeting with National tomorrow around understanding exactly what they're going to do on the conditional grant side for health, because we have to be very careful that they do not unnecessarily reduce conditional grants, particularly for compensation of employees. Then on the following slide, this slide just gives a summary of the reserve position. So what we've also had to do is take into account all those changes, also make sure that there are sufficient reserves for big spending areas over the MTEF for the province. The first column are figures that the committee has seen already. And the most important one there is the third last one, which is the COVID-19 response reserve of 800 million, which, as the Minister said in his speech, remains in reserve because we are still concerned about a possible fourth wave, and we may have to allocate some of that money for fourth wave. And then there are the usual reserves for unforeseen and unavoidable expenditure. And then, as Annelies indicated, in 22-23, we've put aside a reserve for COE because we're still waiting for certainty from National on that, and that has affected the numbers. Then on the following slide, this then summarizes the entire framework together. So I've spoken, if we just go line by line, I've spoken about the equitable share allocation. I've spoken about the preliminary allocations for conditional grants. There have been some rollovers to conditional grants for 21-22. Then on the own receipts line, those are receipts from the province that that different votes receive, and we do a modelling exercise to get a sense of what those will be over the MTEF, and those are particularly things like motor vehicle license fees and health fees. Then we have some money in reserve for asset financing. Then we have some money available from the Provincial Revenue Fund for financing over the MTEF. And then the Provincial Revenue Fund also receives tax receipts, particularly from gambling and liquor. And that brings us all to an overall provincial funding envelope over the MTEF, which, as you can see, the funding envelope reduces in the second year, in 23-24, and the main driver of that reduction is the reduction in the equitable share in that year. And then goes up to 76 billion over the MTIF. So that gives you a broad framework, if you think about it, of the inflows into the province over the MTIF. And then what we've done here is and there's quite a long discussion in the NTS documentation about this, which is actually where does that money go? And where does the majority of that money go? And as members know, the majority of the spending over the MTIF is concentrated in what is called the social wage, which is basically provincial services that are provided to all citizens, but they're mainly provided to the less fortunate, because many of the wealthier citizens obviously access private services. So you can think about this as sort of a social wage which support the citizens of the province. And our main spending items, as the committee well knows, is health, education, social protection, and housing and community amenities. And what we give there is the figures over the MTIF for the preliminary allocations in these big areas. We'll speak a little bit in a moment about why the 22-23 numbers are slightly higher than normal. In this particular case under health, is because there's still some COVID money, and in education there is also still some money for teaching assistants. And in the case of both of votes, and we'll discuss it in a moment, or we can deal with that in questions, there will also be an allocation for wages from the reserve. So if you take slides, if you just scroll back one up again, sorry, Paul, up to 23. If you take slides 23 and 24 together, they give members a vision of what the total amount of money is available to be spent, and then 24 gives you a sense of where the majority of the money will be spent on the preliminary allocations over the MTIF. So that was sort of a very quick overview of the MTIF process and how we got to our preliminary allocations. I'm now going to go back to Annelies for her to talk through the other big component of today, which is obviously the adjustments budget.
Thank you, Ray. So the adjustments budget for 2021, some of the principles on which the budget is based. It also follows from the objectives articulated over the 2022 MTF as in the medium-term budget policy statement. So as Roy indicated to you, I mean, there is in terms of a big section on risks. And therefore in the adjustments budget, we also then following along in terms of making sure that the departments in this fiscally constrained environment they are managing and mitigating their risks in here, and making sure that they are being able to deal with those risks within their baselines. Then further, this adjustments budget then also has an opportunity to prepare and departments for the 22 MTF, and therefore the opportunity is given in this adjustments budget to realign and reallocate funding from the current financial year, the 21-22 financial year, to the 2022 MTF. And this is really to facilitate in terms of making sure that the planning planning and implementation is aligned around certain policy priorities, including infrastructure, and also making sure that we are preparing ourselves for implementation from the 1st of April 2022. I've indicated that the adjustments budget funds the 2021 wage agreement, and around that 2021 wage agreement, we took a differentiated approach in funding the wage agreement. We took into account the votes, whether they were able to accommodate the current wage agreement within the current baseline. We also took into consideration the headcount within departments, because the wage agreement is really driven by headcount eventually. Then when we look at in terms of how the adjustments budget is therefore funded on the next slide, and when we look in terms of funding, in terms of what has really come from national, and so the total that is funds this adjustments budget from funding that has come from national totals about 1.739 billion rand. Now that 1.739 billion rand is made up of 1.7 billion that comes from equitable share, and that is for the Presidential Employment Initiative. About 603 million of that is for education and health. Education receiving 566 million, and that is in terms of for general teaching assistance, and then health staff and nursing assistance is receiving about 36.4 million rand. Then in terms of the wage agreement, we are funding 1.1 billion rand, and I'll give the detail on the next slide around the 1.1 billion on how that is made up of. We're also receiving in terms of additional national conditional grants, and this is mainly in terms of for health, for oncology, as well as for the early childhood development grant within social development, and that makes up the majority of the 35 million rand. So that is what we are receiving and funding in this adjustments budget from the national fiscus, about 1.74 billion rand. Then from the provincial side and provincial funding, funding is mostly coming from over collection of revenue of the previous financial year. There's certain both sets increasing their own revenue in this financial year. We are funding certain policy priorities within this adjustments budget to the value of 189 million rand, and then rollover of the previous financial year. And this is mainly commitments of the previous financial year that is paid in the current financial year. So for us as a province, what we are responding to, for example, is in terms of rolling over and the commitment of funds in terms of some of our infrastructure projects within education. We're able also with this provincial funding to respond to the pressure that health is facing currently with the third wave, and in terms of some of the projections for the fourth wave, we're able to respond to health with an additional 211 million rand. We're also able to respond from a safety perspective for the Golden Arrow bus services, for technology in the various buses in terms of safety of commuters. And then also we're able in terms of purchasing property for mostly for education and for health services. So that is what the provincial funding then is able for us to respond to. As I indicated, part of the principles of this adjustments budget is also to realign the current financial year in terms of planning and implementation, as well as in terms of responding from an infrastructure perspective. So there is an opportunity, and the departments have taken up that opportunity to reduce their budgets to the value of about 1 billion rand, but the majority of that funding is then allocated over the 2022 MTF, and the detail of that I will also indicate in a slide to come. So all in all, the net effect therefore for this adjustments budget is that we are adding just a little under 1.5 billion rand to the main budget, which we tabled on the 16th of March. So some of the detail, for example, around the wage agreement, as I indicated to you, the 1.1 billion on the next slide shows you in terms of what we received from national. So in terms of the Division of Revenue Act, we received for the 2021 wage agreement 1.4 billion rand. But I indicated as well that the differentiated approach that we're taking in this province, and making sure that we only fund what we really need to fund. We're making sure that the departments are able to absorb. Where departments have been able to absorb the wage agreement, they have done so. And what we then funding then out of the 1.4 billion is 1.1 billion, which is mainly in our frontline services within education, health and social development. And you see the breakdown of the funding that is given to those three votes. So that is how the 1.1 billion rand is essentially made up of. So then we're also indicating to you in terms of what is left over of the 1.4 billion rand and what is being utilized for. So there's 315 million rand left over of the wage agreement. We are in terms of making an allocation for education, for infrastructure in terms of accelerating their maintenance projects and also some of the capital projects. And this is also to ensure that they are able to deal with learner placement in the next year, and that is to the value of 200 million allocation in 2022, and then the 115 million that is therefore left, that is then also for 2022 MTEF priorities that has been allocated. Then in terms of the 1 billion rand that I indicated that departments are using for realignment to the new MTEF, this is mainly around infrastructure, and this then allows departments also to smooth the infrastructure projects. Some of the details around the infrastructure we will also be indicating in Q2, but as it in terms of the infrastructure and where they found themselves in terms of the implementing departments, is that COVID-19 is still having an impact in terms of our implementation and infrastructure, mainly in terms of restrictions of lockdown that happens on the site. But then there also is in terms of some supply issues within the construction industry that is also impacting in terms of our infrastructure rollout. So in terms of the projects that therefore are returning funding in terms of the current financial year and allocating that funding over the new MTEF, there's broadband in terms of 22 million. This is mainly in terms of impact of COVID, and that is the rollout of sites that could not happen according to plan. In terms of the LEAP project, there is a reduction to the main budget. So as in the main budget, we budgeted 350 million rand for this financial year for LEAP. We're reducing that amount by 184 million rand. Now, I need to indicate that that does not mean that there is in terms of a reduction in the LEAP project or a reduction in the outputs of the project. It is realigning in terms of the planning and the financing of the project in line in terms of the implementation. Because of COVID, the training of the officers never happened as according to plan, and therefore there is a lag in terms of the training, which then impacts in terms of the kind of funding that happens in this financial year. So this funding is then also allocated to the next financial year, and therefore it is not reducing the overall allocation to the LEAP project. Then within infrastructure, both within the education, and then you'll see in terms of roads and in terms of some of the general public works, in terms of the child and youth care centers, there's 290 million that is reduced for education, 337 million that is reduced for roads, and 19 million that is reduced for child and youth care centers in terms of infrastructure. This is also, as I indicated, all allocated in the 2022 financial year. In the green economy, the municipal energy resilience, this is a reduction in the current financial year for this project, not reducing its outputs, but it's aligning it in terms of overall over the MTEF in terms of the general outline implementation of the project. Then in terms of what is left over of the billion rand is 141 million that has been surrendered to the Provincial Revenue Fund by the various departments. And the next slide then gives you in terms of the proposed allocations and the adjustments then to the various votes. And to get an understanding then of the adjustments budget, it then gives us this opportunity to respond to COVID-19. It then is also making sure that our frontline services has in terms of the funding in order to respond to the pressures that they have indicated that they are facing, and that was mainly around the wage agreement. It also then gives us an opportunity to expand some of the delivery on our recovery plan from a safety perspective. It allows us to smooth our infrastructure budgeting and delivery, and it most importantly to protect infrastructure budgets as well in the current financial year, and making sure that we are still spending infrastructure funding as we've indicated before. And then lastly, as I indicated, this adjustments budget, then we are managing and making sure we're managing our risks and making sure that we're putting mitigation in place. So when we look at this adjustments budget, then very quickly, then from the Department of the Premier, you see a reduction in the middle column. There is the total adjustments per vote on the main budget, and then indicating what the new adjusted budget then is. For Department of the Premier, very quickly, that is a reduction because of broadband. Provincial Parliament is a rollover in terms of various projects that they have commitments for. Provincial Treasury, that is mainly in terms of a reduction within funding of the gambling board. And then in terms of community safety, I indicated there's a reduction in this current financial year on the LEAP project, but funded then in the next financial year. Education receives funding from both the Presidential Employment Initiative and as well as in terms of the wage agreement. Health is in terms of the wage agreement and being able to respond for COVID-19 and continue that response over and above what is in the main budget for COVID-19. Social development is in both in terms of an increase in the ECD conditional grant and funding for the wage agreement. Human settlements, there's an increase in terms of affordable housing projects up to the value of 49 million for human settlements. Environmental affairs is in terms of a shift around security for the Drift Sands Nature Reserve. And then transport and public works, you'll see a net reduction is the reduction on the roads outside of the budget, but then there is also in terms of allocations for safety for Golden Arrow bus services, as well as operational costs in terms of for our traffic police. Agriculture is an increase in terms of rollover of purchasing laptops and in terms of agricultural equipment. Economic development, as I indicated, is in terms of the current reduction in the MERS project, but then allocated to the next financial year. Cultural affairs and sport is a rollover for purchasing of library material, and local government, finally, in terms of the reduction you see there, is in terms of reducing in terms of the current route support in the current financial year, and then also then smoothing that funding over to the new MTF. That then all in all makes then the addition, a net addition of 1.4 billion rand for this adjustments budget. Then just lastly, in terms of a finishing off of this adjustments budget, on the infrastructure side, on the next slide, in terms of indicating to you in terms of one of the publications is also in terms of our infrastructure. And we can see then for infrastructure here, when we tabled the main budget, infrastructure totaled about just a little bit over 9 billion rand. And when we took our virtual and catalytic infrastructure into consideration as well, it totaled about 9.6 billion rand. As I indicated, in terms of the challenges that's currently being faced and the impact that COVID-19 is still having in the infrastructure environment, the infrastructure is being reduced by 434 million. So our new infrastructure budget there for 2021 amounts to about 8.6 billion rand. When we're looking at our catalytic and virtual infrastructure together, then that is about 9.1 billion. So where the adjustments, it's mainly in terms of upgrades and additions, as well as on refurbishment, and that is in terms of some of the maintenance projects. When we look in terms of the impact that this then has in terms of where the spending then of the 8.6 billion then finds is still happening, this table then gives you an idea in terms of geographically, in terms of the metro and the districts, in terms of how much of the 8.6 billion is spent in terms of the metro and the districts, but also indicating to you by which department, provincial department, is spending within the metro and the districts. Further, this table then also indicates to you of the 8.6 billion rand, majority of that, as per the services for the province is about 57% is that in terms of our social infrastructure, while 43% is more in terms of our economic infrastructure. Then lastly, just also in terms of from the publication, some of the next slide, it then gives you an idea as well in terms of where most of that funding then finds itself. In the city of Cape Town is about 41% of the 8.6 billion rand. And then also, it's then also indicating that in the Cape Winelands, there is about 974 million, which is the next big spending in terms of the district. Finally, the publication also then gives you some idea in terms of per capita spending on our infrastructure, both in the metro and in the district, and also just indicating to you that of the expenditure within our allocations on infrastructure, there are infrastructure then finds itself that is across different districts. So that is excluded in terms of the per capita spending that you see there. That's it from the adjustments budget side.
Thank you very much, team. To conclude then, Chairperson, there are, I think, as we've identified, significant fiscal risks and quite a bit of uncertainty that remains in the environment that we are trying to proactively manage in both the adjustment estimate and the medium-term budget policy statement through identifying our risks and making sure that they are proactively mitigated. We are also rigorously applying budget principles to make sure that across this budget process to make sure that the allocation of resources is aligned with priorities of government. I think it's very important there to just pause on a statement that Dr. Haberman had made, that this is not all about more money. In fact, in an environment where we are facing deepening resource constraints, we must put more emphasis on expenditure effectiveness, on development impact, and on non-fiscal measures that can help us to achieve that. And I think that is what we are increasingly doing, in making sure that we're not just spending for its own sake, but we're spending to maximize development impact. Over the medium term, the budget will ensure that we are able to still mount an effective COVID-19 response, support the recovery plan priorities of job safety and well-being, support our frontline service delivery efforts, drive infrastructure delivery programs, giving increasingly more certainty to the infrastructure resource envelopes that are available, strengthen our municipal support and oversight programs, deepen value for money, strengthen procurement practices and procurement transparency, and continue to deepen our risk mitigation practices. We believe that will contribute quite practically to enabling the Western Cape to be ready to reopen and recover, and for the economy to get back to work. Thank you very much. Back to you, Minister Mania.
Thank you, HOD. I don't have any concluding remarks, and our team are obviously in the hands of the chairperson and the committee. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, before we head on to the next presentation, I'm first going to take hands on this particular one, given that we're trying to pair the budget and MERO documents, and then we'll have the financial and non-financial performance separately. Thank you so much. So if I could just have the first round of hands. Okay, I see Member America's hand. Member Murray. Okay, those two hands up so far. Okay, then Member Nkondlo, I'll take those three hands first for the first round. Thank you so much, in that order.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I think that it's an unenviable task for Treasury to put together a budget that is conceptualized in a very financially constrained environment. Chair, I have 3 questions. One of the principles that were identified at the start of the presentation relates to long-run financial sustainability. Now, in terms of sustainability in the long run, how are we going to achieve it if the majority of our allocations came from national? And I know it was stated that one of the ways in which we could achieve financial sustainability throughout the presentation is the reorientation of spending priorities, as well as achieving great efficiencies within our operations. So I'm just a little concerned in terms of, in our quest to achieve long-run fiscal sustainability, is that we may in the end compromise service delivery within those service delivery departments that we are spending most of our allocations. Perhaps just a commentary with regard to that. And the second question that I'd like to ask, Chair, relates to the repurposing of conditional grants from national government in terms of aligning the allocation of those grants in the context of what they perceive as the joint district model, whereas we have a different conception, such as the joint metro district model. How would those two align with each other in terms of the allocation of those grants to municipalities? And then thirdly, Chair, in terms of the reduction in the local government department in particular, Ms. Spick was saying that the reduction of over 6 million rand largely is as a result of the current drought support that will not be allocated this year, but it will be rolled over. So we know that drought within our province in certain areas is a significant risk, and the minister in his speech this morning outlined the risk mitigating allocations for the medium term, and particular reference was made to the disaster management department to mitigate those risks. And drought is a significant risk. And I have not seen in the presentation where the allocation for the first year of 379 million rand is being sort of accommodated, and perhaps, I've missed it, and perhaps the department could respond to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Member Murray.
Thank you so much, Chair. I think that this is a very good budget. Looking at it, you covered most angles which a person expect in terms of risk management. But you must admit that most of the things that has risks attached to it is out of your hands. Factors like the value of the rand, factors like the weather, in terms of the farmers and whether they can produce crops, influx, which we cannot control, of people raising demands for houses, health services, and all these things come in as a pot of problems. What have you done, or what can we do to make sure that the equitable share take sufficiently into account the pressure on infrastructure and services created by these open boundaries, open borders? There's no way we can guess how many hundreds of thousands of people will walk across the border within the next couple of months. And there's also nothing we can do about it because of national policies. So I pity you, actually, but I want to know if we are spending most of our money on jobs and housing, is that jobs and housing going to be for our own people? And what have you done? What steps have you taken to make sure when you build roads or repair roads, and we know that infrastructure is the best creator of jobs, building new infrastructure. But every time somebody knock on my door here asking for jobs, it's foreigners. I don't know whether there's an answer to this, but I would like to know your opinion on this. And then I would like to know why, how can you say that there is growing demands and unemployment rates have been declining, but at the same time we are spending less and the rand is getting weaker? How is unemployment declining if we see more and more people standing at robots asking for work? And I want to know, to sum up, have you budgeted for poverty alleviation, or do you leave it to national government? Do we have a policy on poverty eradication, or are we leaving it to national government? I know that you have done well in spending money on education, but we are educating people at the moment for the unemployment queue. So how do we match these two issues? We're spending billions on educating people only to let them sit at home. Isn't it time that you create jobs for unskilled people? There's no jobs for skilled people. They're sitting at home with their degrees. And are the money that you have for to create more jobs, is it aimed at that market, the unskilled workers, or is it mostly going for skilled workers? I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Member Nkondlo. And then I'm going to ask that Members Brinkas, Member van der Westhuizen, I do note your hands. I'm going to ask that we just keep your hands for the second round, just so that Provincial Treasury has an opportunity to deal with the first round. Thank you. Member Nkondlo.
No, thank you, Chairperson, and thank you for the presentation. Chair, the other questions I would ask may not necessarily be in certain slides, but just to try and understand both the speech of the minister and the relationship, I think, of the MTPPS to the general state of the economy that is also being presented by the good doctor from the Provincial Treasury. The first one, Chair, I just want to understand in this notion or the theme of the budget backing up you, I'm assuming you, as I think it says, is business households. Did the department have any public participation with the business sector, with the households, also to integrate what would have been their inputs in sort of affirming its theme of a budget aimed at working for these constituencies. Secondly, Chair, in as far as the Mero is concerned, I understand that it's still coming later in the presentation, but I'm interested to understand now that I think the doc was speaking about how the integration between it and the IDPs. Firstly, if maybe the department can just explain to me in a more detail and maybe with an example to demonstrate how the Pero and Mero from a budget integrated planning point of view gets to be done by the province together with the relevant municipalities. In particular, how the MTBPS itself, has got any link, whether straight or dotted line, to the IDP process.
Apologies for interrupting you, Member Nkondlo. Member Lily, I'm just going to ask that you please put your video off. Member Nkondlo is currently on the floor. I'm just going to ask that you please put your video off. Thank you. Member Nkondlo, you may continue.
Thank you, Chair. I think I was just saying if I can just get an understanding of how, from a planning point of view, because I know that the municipalities are now starting public participations on the IDP, on how in practical form, and maybe in whatever methodology that is being used to ensure that the findings of the Mero are found in those IDP. The other one for me, Chair, perhaps the minister can answer to this one, is the extent to which this MTBPS actually helps the province respond to one of the findings of the provincial economic review we received in September, particularly on the two areas of the informal economy and youth. And I'm raising this because from where I'm sitting, and I would like the department with the minister perhaps to indicate to me that outside of the presidential youth employment intervention and its budget, one cannot necessarily see directly how are we placing, I think, that data we got and it's telling, from the Pero, of the informal economy's role in ramping up the economy, including, I think, the issue of youth. So I'm trying to understand, and if maybe the minister and also the department can indicate to me, how is that responded to outside of the presidential youth intervention. And then I think Ms. Peak speaks about, I think, the differentiated approach for frontline services, in terms of managing the COE. I'm interested maybe just for her to explain to us in more layman's terms, what does the differentiated approach entails, what does it mean? And also, given, I think, the issue that is always raised in the province of the population increase, which is a function of the in-migration. If you then talk about curbing or sort of keeping a conservative COE, so I'm interested perhaps on what that differentiated approach, especially for the frontline services, would actually mean. And if, for the province, is there any formula in terms of what would define, the numbers quantitatively, between, personnel versus, a number of population, which is something I've seen being done, I think, in other departments. I'm just asking if hypothetically that we do have such a way of quantifying, what we justify, as a sufficient personnel, particularly in these frontline service departments. And I'm raising this in context to the issue I'm raising about population sort of increase. My last one, Chair, sorry to be long. My last one, I would really like to understand, I think in the last slide, there is a mention there, I think, of the social and economic infrastructure, Perhaps if I can be explained, what do the two mean? And I'm seeing that social infrastructure is more, it's about 57% versus 43% in terms of economic infrastructure. What does that mean? And I'm raising this in context to the economic recovery and assuming that as the province, from the premier to the minister, we've always talked about balancing livelihoods, versus lives. And I'm assuming in this language, one would always try, and I think the province has been very vocal about, and I think that is what is being said even here, to keep to try and keep the economy opened, and that's why I'm asking a definition first, so that I don't make assumptions of what that spend means in real terms of what is social infrastructure and why it is more than economic infrastructure spending. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Minister and HOD Savage. You can indicate who will be answering the respective questions. And then I have members Brinkhuis, Van der Westhuizen and Moran for the second round of questions so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chairperson. I will hand over to the department and then I will conclude with my own responses. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I will pass on to some of my colleagues, particularly Dr. Haberman and Ms. Pick, but let me take a first go at some of the questions. Honourable Member America asks around the issue of long-run fiscal sustainability and whether that may compromise service delivery in the short term. I think we've got a multi-pronged strategy for long-run fiscal sustainability. The first is to understand the likely scenarios that we are facing going into the medium term and beyond in a sort of 3, 5 and 10-year horizon, and to get greater foresight into what likely scenarios there are that are facing the province, and therefore what fiscal sustainability would mean in each of those contexts. So our foresight work, our fiscal futures work, is actually quite critical to that, and we do publish a few graphs looking at the revenue side of that, which is some of the output of that work. That's critical because it's very important that on the expenditure side, one doesn't overcommit relative to likely resource envelopes going forward, no matter which scenario one selects. But I think that, we are, of course, aware that in the course of our COVID response, we have, I think, quite appropriately utilized the resources that had been saved by the province over time as a buffer against the impact of COVID and the need for a powerful health response. We do need over time to rebuild that buffer. The big strategic question is, do you try and do that all at once now, or do you do that incrementally over time, and if so, at what pace? Now, I think it's very much the latter strategy that underpins our thinking at the moment. In other words, we certainly do acknowledge the extreme pressures on service delivery, and so to accrue money to savings, however important that may be for long-run fiscal sustainability, but to accrue them too rapidly to savings at this point would not be appropriate. What we have done, therefore, is also to introduce, as of last year, the Fiscal Transition Support Facility, which is really providing support to departments that are looking to restructure their expenditure profiles so that they are reducing their baseline expenditure commitments, and while preserving or expanding the outputs that they produce. So it's a multi-pronged strategy, I think, on restoring fiscal sustainability. It will, over the medium to longer term, include gradually rebuilding savings. for the province, but it is trying to do that in a strategic way relative to the contexts of likely scenarios we will face, and to provide support to departments in restructuring their own baselines. Honourable America, you also asked the question around the repurposing of conditional grants and the district development model versus the JDMA in the province. The final proposals for conditional grants related to the district development model are not yet available. So you know, the information we have on conditional grants for the 2022 MTEF is still quite tentative. But I would say that the district development model and the JDMA are actually pretty closely aligned. Maybe I'm not close enough to the issue, but while the language that's used is different, I don't think that the intent is all that different. So about better leveraging the coordinating capacity of district municipalities and improving and making productive relationships between local and district municipalities right across the planning and implementation system, right across the public expenditure management cycle from a treasury perspective. So I think that they are aligned. If anything, the Western Cape, the JDMA in the Western Cape is slightly ahead of thinking and is informing the evolution of the district development model. I will ask my colleague Annelies Pick to talk to your third question on the reductions and drought support and disaster risk management. Other than to say that, of course, one of the things that we are doing is making sure that we do have disaster response capability available in our unforeseen and unavoidable expenditure reserve right across the 22 MTEF. And that has been a priority for us because we do know that this province is prone to disasters. We've been watching very carefully the heavy rains that have been experienced in some parts of the province over the last week or two. You know, we were in similar areas dealing with situations of drought shortly before that. What we are putting front and center in this is that a proactive management of disaster risks. Now there's some risks that are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns, and we want to try and whittle down the number of unknown unknowns that face us, because that can quickly present itself as fiscal risk that then becomes difficult to manage fiscally. So that's just at a broader level, and I think it's why we've put such great emphasis on risk management at this stage in the budget process, and we'll be continuing that throughout. There are often risks that one can manage that are maybe sitting 5 years out, that with proactive management will not generate fiscal pressure for the province, and that's proactive management is precisely what we are looking for, and we're wanting to make sure that all votes are doing the same. Honourable Murray, I mean, I think that you picked up on some of those risks. I think one of the risks that we face at the moment is a growing population. Yes, I think we all understand that. I think that over time that is projected, the rate of growth is projected to slow. Roughly about half of that growth comes from, it's little under half of that growth, population growth comes from in-migration to the province. And it's important, I think, to realise that those demographic shifts are not just to the Western Cape as a whole, but are often into more urban areas of the Western Cape, as well as being seasonal in some cases. I think on top of that, what the data is not really clearly demonstrating at this point is the extent to which there's been demographic volatility as a result of COVID and the impacts across the sub-region and across other provinces in South Africa. The formula is a little, provincial equitable share formula does obviously lag behind because it uses official data on population movements, but it does lag behind what the actual movements might be, and where it tries to represent pressure on facilities that itself has been disrupted in times of COVID as well. So, for example, there is one of the variables in the formula is around utilization of health facilities, but utilization became very volatile and extraordinary under COVID, with a lot of de-escalation of services and so forth. So we do discuss those technical dynamics extensively with national government, and certainly as we lay out in the medium-term budget policy statement, we do have some quite robust debates with national government on shifts to the formula, shifts to data updates, and so forth, because we're well aware of the pressures that we face in terms of service delivery in the Western Cape. There is, I think, what we have pointed out is that there has been growing demand for services, and while until prior to COVID there were some gains being made in reducing unemployment in the Western Cape, that has been upended somewhat with the economic recovery now accelerating far ahead of recovery and employment, and I think that the recent developments with the new variant are likely to entrench that in the short term. So the employment picture, I think, is relatively complicated, and I think Dr. Haberman can talk in more detail to that. There are a number of things that we do in the province to address both high and structural levels of unemployment, as well as more cyclical unemployment. We have an extensive social wage program that we are reporting on here on the same method that national government uses to report on the social wage in this MTBPS, and we have extensive public employment programs that are either part of or in addition to national programs in that regard. And then, of course, we have extensive skills programs as well, trying to make sure that our school leavers are well trained for the world of work as well. But I think Dr. Haberman can talk more about that. Honourable Nkondlo, I think we will get into quite a lot of information on the Mero in the next presentation, but you did ask the question of the planning integration and how it gets integrated with budgets at municipal level. And clearly, there's a process post-tabling of dissemination where we're very keen to take the Mero into individual districts, and we're in fact producing it now as separate booklets this year, so that they are more targeted to the audiences we're trying to reach. We complement that with our socioeconomic profiles of municipalities, which go down to the local municipal level, and at technical level, what we do beyond dissemination is to engage with municipalities through our technical and strategic integrated municipal engagements and in the JDMA process, which then are so that these documents are treated as inputs to IDPs and to the medium-term revenue and expenditure frameworks of municipalities as well. It's not yet clear whether all municipalities will replace their IDPs in this cycle or whether they'll wait for another year. They do, I believe, have the option in that respect, but these are the resources that are available to them and are interfaced with them through the JDMA process. And perhaps Mr. Kenyon can speak a little bit, or Mr. Boyson can speak a little bit further to that. And then I will ask Dr. Haberman to talk to the issues around youth, the informality in youth in the budget. Ms. Pick to talk to the COE issues, and On the infrastructure side, let me just end by saying, yes, I appreciate your question, Honourable Nkondlo, there, in terms of the definition between social and economic infrastructure. These are standard definitions, and you'll notice in that table, social infrastructure includes schools and clinics, health and education infrastructure. Many economists would actually argue that that in itself is economic infrastructure, because clearly it's around developing skills for the economy, a healthy workforce, and so forth. And so they have deep economic impacts. The split that you see in the categorization there is that it's largely roads and some public works infrastructure and some agricultural and ecological infrastructure that's classified as economic infrastructure, while it's the core functions of provincial government around health, education, social development that are classified as social infrastructure. But I think one should quite rightly, as I think you were implying, avoid falling into the trap of saying that social infrastructure has no implications for the economy. In fact, it's often very fundamental to the economy just over a longer run period of time. But let me hand over to Dr. Haverman to cover those outstanding points, and then Ms. Pick, and then Mr. Boyson or Mr. Kenyon on the final Mero issue.
Thank you very much, HOD. Yes, I think the member really has put her finger on it, and we actually summarised parts of the what was found in the PERO regarding youth unemployment on page 18 of the MTBS document, where we set out the fact that youth unemployment rate is obviously higher than for older workers, older people, and that's really a common thing in South Africa. That across all provinces there is a substantially higher problem of youth unemployment. In terms of how we are responding to the youth unemployment problem and the unemployment problem generally, a lot of that is covered in chapter 4 of the book, particularly if you look at the diagram on page 68. Unfortunately, now in this online world, we can't go through the documents all together at the same time, but the electronic version should be hopefully was circulated or has been received. But we really go into quite a lot of detail about the sort of very high level and big things that we're looking at enhancing jobs, and that talks to things like ease of doing business, investment, infrastructure, work opportunities and skills, and economic resilience. And part of that is quite a comprehensive public employment program. These include things like the School Assistant Project, infrastructure maintenance at education facilities, training and placement of unemployed youth in business processes services. That's one of the initiatives led by the Department of Economic Development and Tourism. Ecological infrastructure restoration, river protection projects, that's something from the Department of Agriculture, and they're also doing something along canal maintenance. These are sort of programs that the province is rolling out that really absorb large numbers of the unemployed, and we have been certainly looking over the past few years at ways of how to enhance spending on that. And we estimate that there will be an additional 66,000 employment opportunities per year through these projects. And then, of course, as the member highlighted, there is also money being allocated for the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. A large amount of that goes to the Western Cape Education Department, and we estimate that they'll be able to create approximately 20,000 employment opportunities in 2022, and then 11,000 in 2023. So I think the member's quite right that sort of is how we try and link what we find in the PERO. And many times what the PERO does is just highlight things we all know, right? It's a youth unemployment problem. But trying to understand the problem in more detail really helps us with this comprehensive response around the employment issues. So I think I've covered all my questions, Adrian, unless I miss anything. Otherwise, then I'll hand over to Ms.
Thank you. I'm first going to deal with member America's question on the 6 million on the drought reduction. And just to indicate that this is, as I indicated in the presentation, it is in terms of a realignment of the allocation. So the funding is allocated to the 2022 financial year. But in the current main budget for drought, we have given funding which is more than the 6 million and for various kind of support around in terms of drought. The funding that is now being reduced is really in terms of capacity, in terms of that part of the drought support, and we've given funding for capacity within the department, but also in terms of to support for example, for geohydrologists to assist in terms of looking at the various parts of drought response, in terms of whether that is in terms of a borehole response for municipalities, or in terms of looking at in terms of the overall the water supply, in terms of engineers from that perspective. And so what the department has not been able to on this stage in terms of the number of posts and geohydrologists that they wanted to fill, they have not been able to actually meet that total number of support and capacity. They have in terms of at this stage in terms of have made some contract employment, and then they are looking at and started already the permanent employment of some of the drought support capacity, but that will only the staff will only start employment from the 1st of April, and that is the reasoning for the realignment of the funding then around the drought support. So it's not indicating that that is total drought funding within the Department of Local Government. Then on the question about the COE, and Mem Kondlo asked about in terms of the differentiated approach in terms of COE. So let me then start in terms of saying that, let's say, a generic approach for funding of COE would be, and funding of the wage agreement for the COE would be in terms of a calculation which National did do in terms of saying of the 1.4 billion rand, what that equates to is in terms of the number of staff that qualifies for the wage agreement. What we've then taken approach is saying that we do not dispute that is the amount required to fund the wage agreement. What we then took into consideration is, number one, is in terms of the fiscal position of the department in the current situation. So the overall performance of the department, how much the department is in terms of looking at in terms of spending its COE budget, whether there is any availability of reprioritization within that vote, and that was taken into consideration. And when we put our adjustments budget together at the technical level with each and every department. So when we took that into consideration, and we looked at the current performance and the pressures indicated by the votes around the wage agreement, it was our frontline services department, being education, health and social development, around for our teachers, doctors, nurses, and for our social workers. We need to understand that the social sector comprises about 91% of our total COE personnel headcount, and so they are extremely headcount driven. And because the wage agreement then is also headcount driven, in terms of the wage agreement this year is different to previous years. Previous years there was a percentage on salary. This year it is in terms of per headcount an amount was negotiated, and therefore the more headcount and more staff a department has, therefore the bigger the pressure would be on the department where the wage agreement was concerned. And that's what I meant in terms of the differentiated approach then takes into account how heavy in terms of headcount the department is, and then also in terms of the position that the department found itself in the current financial year around in terms of its fiscal position. And therefore that is what then makes up the differentiated approach. So when we looked at in terms of the pressures for the votes, both indicated by the votes themselves and in terms of calculations in which the Treasury then has made in terms of finding funding within votes in terms of to cover COE as much as possible. Those three, the social services departments, were the ones that showed the most pressure, and therefore the 1.1 billion rand funding that's made now in this adjustments budget to fund the wage agreement. And that is what we mean by a differentiated approach. So it's not that it's one funding approach and everyone is funded exactly the same. So the situation of the department is taken into consideration. The same in terms of with the COE strategy, a differentiated approach is that each of the departments would now have to look at their own COE composition, and therefore in terms of being able to respond according to that composition. So that is what the departments need to take into consideration. They need to take into consideration in terms of the service delivery needs that they need to respond to. That's the first thing. The second thing that they also need to take into consideration is in terms of how much of their staff is at the retirement age, and what that impact would be on the COE budget, as well as the impact that retirees could make on the service delivery of their department. It also needs to take into consideration any excess staff that it's also carrying on its COE budget, and therefore those characteristics and criteria is different across the board, and therefore each of the departments must take their own situation into consideration, and therefore we're then saying that's how the COE strategy then will be from a differentiated approach, taking the context of the actual department into consideration. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Malcolm, did you want to add on the MERO processes? Malcolm, you're on mute.
Oh, sorry, apologies. It just relates to the issue of the IDP, which essentially requires that municipalities must do an assessment of the existing level of development in the municipality and identify the communities which do not have access to basic municipal service. So the MERO does provide the socioeconomic realities in chapters 1, 2, and 4. So that enables the municipalities to take that critical information on board. And then furthermore, we also, when we do the assessment of the budget and the IDP, we also test the responsiveness of the budget. Furthermore, the information contained in the MERO is also for the private sector. It also presents opportunities for investment in a particular area. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope we've addressed all of the questions. Minister, did you want to add anything?
Thank you. I just wanted to very briefly supplement two replies. I did mention in my presentation this morning the reduction of 540 million rand, or the net 540 million rand reduction in the provincial equitable share. And of course, many members have put questions about the provincial equitable share. I think that Team Finance should also, are possibly being a little bit modest, and I think that committee members should be aware that Team Finance mounted a very robust opposition to any reduction in the provincial equitable share, and we do set out the particulars of that matter in the NTBPS book. Now, we were obviously not as a team able to succeed in resisting the adjustment. We were able to, where we did succeed, was to ensure that the reduction was phased in over a longer period of time than anticipated. And as a result of that, we did manage to, in fact, reduce the reduction to about 1.2 billion over the medium term, which left us, as David Savage mentioned earlier, with a net reduction of about 540 million over the medium term. Then on the question of employment, which was largely traversed by Dr. Roy Havemann, he of course mentioned the Presidential Employment Initiative, which is an additional allocation of 600 million, which I referred to in my presentation, and which I think will create very close to about 20,000 work opportunities. In addition to that, he also mentioned the various public employment programs and indeed skills development programs, which will generate about 66,000 youth opportunities. But what we should also be aware of is that we have allocated an additional 50 million rand for public employment programs, which of course was announced in the main budget, but which is now being distributed to municipalities in the form of a local government public employment support grant. And that the purpose, of course, of those funds are to allow municipalities to implement public employment programs that will provide work opportunities for people, especially young people in the Western Cape. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to then ask the next people are, next members are Member Brinkhuis, Van der Westhuizen, and then Member Moran, in that order. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, to the department, more than 6,000 unplaced learners is here in the Western Cape, and January is around the corner. My office is already bombarded by parents asking if the unplaced learners is going to be placed in this next school year of 2022. So my question to the department is that was there any consideration given to these more than 6,000 unplaced learners when the allocation was made for the education infrastructure? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much. Member Van der Westhuizen.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, there's no doubt in my mind that the department would have researched the options to spend money on Golden Arrow assets. Golden Arrow bus service is a very important service. It's extremely important that we have a safe public transport system in the Western Cape, and we all know the challenges and the incidents that have come to the Standing Committee on Transport and Public Works, and we've learned about the horrible attacks and so on Golden Arrow buses. So while the initiative is fully supported, I'm just interested as to how are you going to, can I call it a package, the support to Golden Arrow bus services in order for us as a province to remain within the legislation. And I think if you found an option to do that, it might even be of benefit to other public entities that also would like to spend on initiatives where the private sector is involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Member Moran.
Thanks, Chairperson, and good afternoon to everyone. First, let me also welcome the presentation done by the department. Chair, just three issues. And I've heard now the response from the MEC saying that year on year we received lesser money and lesser money. And over the next few years, basically, we will receive 450 million less. Chair, but if you, for instance, look, Chair, at the equitable share in front of us and what the provincial government will receive over the next 3 years, the only thing that you will see is increases from 54 million in the next financial year to 55 to 57. Even if you look, Chair, at the baseline adjustments, and over the last 2 years of this three-year cycle, even if there's the adjustment, we will still receive more money than we have received over the previous years. The one thing that Chair, and whether I've missed it, I'm not sure, is to see whether in terms of percentage, whether it's downwards or upwards in terms of the actual money that we've received, percentage-wise, whether it is basically an increase or a decrease. I haven't seen those percentages, Chair, so it's difficult to say whether it was an increase and whether it was a decrease in terms of the percentage of the total cake, it will say that's been said at the national level. But what I see over the next 3 years, and I also believe, Chair, the 54.9 million that we will receive in the next financial year is more than the current, the money that we have received in the current financial year. So even in 2023, 24, it's more money. 24, 25, it's more money. So what I see in front of me is more money, it's more money, it's more money. So just in terms of that, the equitable share. Then, Chair, two other issues. And I've heard the explanation by the officials when it comes to your COE. And I also understand basically the position that the government finds, the provincial government finds itself within this year, the head count and the amount per head count. But the CEO, Chair, in the surrender of funds, this is not the first year. We have seen it over the last 2 years, where CEO funds has been surrendered to provincial treasury. In many of those funds, Chair, were money where there's new post that's not been filled or vacant post. And whenever when we discuss this particular issue at the committee level, we were then told, Chair, that some is vacancies where, and especially young persons, where they have left basically the organization, maybe to municipalities because compensation is higher and so forth. And also at what states they were leaving the department was also mentioned as one of the issues. And that's one of the reasons.
Continue with my meeting. Yeah, that's fine.
Member Syed?
Should I? Maybe I'll go to the class along and wait.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll mute you, Member Syed. Okay. Apologies, Member Maran. I have muted Member Syed. You may continue.
Thanks, Chairperson. So, Chair, the surrender of funds when it comes to C, and there's no attempt really, Chair, as I've said now, that one of the explanations is where young persons basically in the department can't keep up when it comes to municipalities, which offers more monies, bigger packages. But year on year, we surrender CEO funds to provincial treasury instead of making sure that we are keeping those expertise within provincial government. That's the one. The last one, Chair, and I've heard also the explanation in terms of, and if you look, for instance, at the different departments, where in some there is basically reductions, in some there's increases, but specifically the local government one, and obviously we're going to discuss it in our committee meetings. The reduction of 6 million rand when it comes to disaster funding to municipalities. And I've heard the explanation, Chair, and I try to understand basically the response to a question that was being asked by the Honourable American. Last year, for instance, Chair, when we visited some of the drought-affected municipalities, your Beaufort West, your Oudtshoorn, and also your Kannaland. And I remember when we have met basically with in Oudtshoorn, the district mayor of the Garden Route was there and basically explained the difficulty and how they basically, the challenges that they face to make sure basically that each and everyone which been affected by drought receive water. They also explained the issue of farmers basically, where farmers just decided to close the gates, lock their doors, and left the farm, and farm workers on those particular farms basically have to fend for themselves, and where basically the district municipality then had to send in trucks, put up infrastructure like your water tanks where people can come basically and get water from, and to make sure that those people basically get the necessary services that they deserve. And now we see, Chair, that although we are saying that these funds will be made provision for within the next financial year, 6 million rand is 6 million rand, and it could have basically, Chair, taken people a long way. For whatever reason, basically this money is being now reduced and surrendered to provincial treasury or to another department, Chair. It is difficult for me to understand, knowing the challenges that those people who are basically affected by the drought, the challenges that they are facing, Chair. So those are basically the three issues, Chair, that I wanted to raise. Because Yes, a handover of funds basically is problematic, especially when it comes basically to saving livelihoods and to make sure that people get the necessary services that they deserve. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I do know we have had a previous presentation regarding baseline reductions during the previous budget regarding the MTF periods, but I'll allow Provincial Treasury to assist with that particular question. Colleagues, given the time constraints, those are the only questions I'm going to allow for now. I would like to encourage members, once this presentation's questions are answered, to take the rest of their questions to their respective committees regarding the specific votes. I'll also keep my own for the respective votes. Thank you so much. HOD.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairperson. Just before the HOD replies, I do want to take a stab at answering the Honourable Moran's question. Now, the Honourable Moran says that he sees more money and more money, 54, 55 and 57 billion. And indeed, that is exactly what I saw, until, of course, Provincial Treasury pointed out to me that these are nominal increases. In other words, they are increases below inflation. And as I said in my speech, we take an 8.4 billion rand knock because, of course, these are increases at below inflation. I must say, in my presentation this morning, I tried to achieve a balanced approach between obviously expressing my disappointment that there was a 540.5 million rand net decrease in the provincial equitable share, but at the same time also welcoming and acknowledging the fact that we did receive a 1.4 billion rand in the 2022-23 financial year for compensation of employees, and also, of course, the 600 million rand additional allocation in the adjustments budget for the presidential employment initiative, which, as I said earlier, should result in close to 20,000 work opportunities for young people in the Western Cape. Thank you. If I could hand over to the HOD.
Thank you, Minister. Yes, I think that there were a number of, I think for Honourable Brinkhuis, you asked the question around unplaced learners. That is actually an area that we've been supporting the Department of Education on quite extensively, and we have regular engagements around that issue. The modelling is in that environment in terms of trying to project the number of unplaced learners and where they would be and how they can be accommodated within the system is obviously extremely complicated. What we've been trying to make sure from the Provincial Treasury perspective is that modelling is underway, that there's a clear strategy associated with making sure that all learners are placed and that the resources are available to resource that strategy. And as so far, and I think this is something obviously to raise with the department itself in terms of the detail of their strategy, but it is now fairly targeted in terms of understanding where the pressure arises, particularly in grades 1 and grade 8, where it might arise geographically, and how it's responded to in terms of both making sure that there are teachers, facilities, and learner transport systems that are available to support them. But there's been quite significant consideration that's been given to this issue by the department, and we have been working with the department on that, and are confident that those measures are in place in order to make sure that both in the next academic year and going forward, that we are able to eliminate as many problems with unplaced learners as it is possible to. One must realize here, of course, and I'm sure the department will be at pains to say this, is that it's not a risk one can completely eliminate at the start start of the academic year, because despite their efforts, certain learners will just arrive at certain schools unanticipated and quite late in registration, and so on and so forth. So the challenge for the department is to whittle that down to a bare minimum of the risk down to a bare minimum by the start of the academic year, and then quickly be able to place learners through the first weeks of the year. But they, as I say, would be able to give considerably more detail on that matter. When it, Honourable van der Westhuizen, on Golden Arrow and the safety allocation, again, I think Department of Transport and Public Works will be best placed to give the precise specifications of the program. We have had a look at it, and we've certainly had a look at the demand, given some alarming episodes that were that occurred in terms of robberies on buses. These buses are very largely funded through the Public Transport Operations Grant administered by the Department of Transport and Public Works. And there is a shared contribution between Golden Arrow and the department in terms of the safety measures that are being put in place on these buses. The mechanism to do so, I don't think, is problematic at all. This is a long-standing partnership and contractual commitment with Golden Arrow, and the additions to the safety of buses is, I think, is something that is in the interests of both the province and obviously the company as a service provider. Honourable Moran, I think the Minister has addressed your first question. I would just simply point out that on page 54 of the MTBPS table 3.1, it shows that the average annual growth rate in nominal terms of the provincial equitable share is about 1.5%, but inflation will be rising by the National Treasury's projections at around 4.5% a year. So in real terms, resources are diminishing quite sharply over the medium term. I think as a Treasury, we are always resistant to the surrender of funding, but we are equally resistant to creating incentives for departments to simply spend for its own sake. In other words, what we see as fiscal dumping, rather than spending to its initial intention. When it comes to compensation of employees, there are a lot of complexity, obviously, in the employment environment. There are churn rates that are experienced, the employer experiences. That some of which can be more volatile. I think you would have probably read about the Great Resignation as a bit of a global trend in workforces. And I think the province is trying to address that through a multi-pronged strategy that it does include talent management, and, as you say, keeping that sharp young talent in government, in public service going forward as well. I think that the Department of the Premier would be very well placed to speak to the range of initiatives that are underway in that respect as well. But the underspending on COE is also a function of when that churn occurs. That replacement employment will come in often will enter at a lower salary level than that exited, and so forth. There may be delays in hiring of a month or two in what was anticipated, and so all of that leads to savings on compensation. But again, I think that those dynamics are something that, as Ms. Pickett said, we are asking departments to more closely drill into on a vote-specific level, as they did generate their own individualized and differentiated compensation of employee strategies in each vote that respond to the different needs, dynamics, and skills profiles of each vote. When it comes to underspending elsewhere outside of compensation of employees, the specific dynamics that are leading to underspending on particular programs will vary quite significantly. On infrastructure programs, for example, one of the challenges that we've had has been global supply chain disruptions when we're trying to import components for capital programs. They're just simply unavailable, and then that slows down spending quite significantly until those components are then available again. There may be other challenges. There can be community unrest. There could be challenges in reaching contractual closure to allow works to start. And obviously there have been knock-on effects of lockdown, which have also slowed up work and the availability of equipment and so forth at different places in the country. On goods and services, it can also be affected by broader supply chain management delays and so forth. I think that certainly from the Provincial Treasury and our ongoing meetings with the votes, we are at pains to encourage votes to execute their spending programs as timeously as possible, obviously making sure that those spending programs are responsibly executed and that it's not just the dumping of financing. But it is an ongoing challenge. It's an ongoing challenge in this environment, and it's something that we are closely monitoring. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. And colleagues, as I've indicated previously, we're going to ask that any extra questions please be referred to the respective departmental votes, and or if it's specific regarding budget committee, that they please then be put in writing or at the resolution stage. A to B, I'm going to ask if we can please move on to the next presentation, as we are a little bit restricted with time.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. The next presentation, we wanted to do a little bit more of a deep dive into the Municipal Economic Review and Outlook. I think that certainly when we've come to the committee before, we've always got a lot of interest in this Municipal Economic Review and Outlook, and that is one of the factors that I think keeps inspiring the team to push the envelope in terms of what is possible with the Mero, and they've done so again very admirably this year. There may not be time, I think, to fully assuage the appetites of the committee on all aspects of the Mero. It is quite a significant piece of work, and so before I hand over to the team, Chairperson, let me just say that we would very much welcome any opportunities to engage the committee further in whatever format would suit you around the Mero. We think it's a really important document, and we've always greatly valued the questions and the guidance that we've got from the committee, which has really helped us to shape the document as it's evolved. So we don't want to hide it under a bushel. And we would really welcome further engagements in whatever format the committee would prefer. We've got some ideas, but let me not put words in the committee's mouth. And with that, I'll hand over to the team chairperson to take us through the Mero. Dr. Haverman, will you hand straight over to the...
Before you continue, because I do know that we also do need to do the financial and non-financial performance, I would just like to test with the committee whether we can move one of the documents to perhaps later in the week. Perhaps we can negotiate with the programming chairperson if we can get an extra hour or so at our next budget committee meeting this week, so that we can deal with the Mero today in the time that we have left over, and perhaps do the second document that's perhaps not as urgent later in the week. So I just would like to quickly test with the committee members as well, just get some advice from our procedural officer, whether we would be able to try and negotiate with the programming committee on this regard. I know that we do have extra documentation this year in this particular meeting compared to usual years. Going once, going twice. Okay, I'm going to take silence as concurrence that perhaps we can then negotiate with programming to move the second quarter financial and non-financial performance. And I'm going to take the discretion then on that, given that I do know the Mero is a very important document and a lot of work has gone into this regard. Ms. Kamish Ahmad, thank you. I see your hand.
Chairperson, the meeting on Wednesday is an hour. We can ask for the extra hour. It also depends on the availability from Treasury side.
Okay, I think HOD is very keen to assist us with some of the extra information. I'm just going to quickly take Member America's hand.
Chair, there is a sitting on Wednesday at 2:15, so we won't be able to fit in an extra hour after the meeting.
I was actually hoping to fit in an extra hour before the meeting, starting a little bit earlier, but I do take note of the sitting time. Thank you so much. But colleagues, with your permission, would it be possible for us to just postpone the financial and non-performance of the second quarter and to allow us to go and find out from the programming committee whether there's some other time perhaps available, because we do only have 45 minutes left of today's meeting, and I do believe that the Mero does take more precedence at this time. Okay, I'm going to take silence as concurrence. HOD, you may go ahead. And if the Department of the Premier, if they are not needed for this presentation, I will then just thank them for staying online, waiting for us to deal with the respective presentations, and we will then postpone that. But the members have in the meantime already gotten the presentation, so they can go through the documentation beforehand so long. Thank you. Ms. Ishmael? Ms. Ishmael, you're on mute.
Thank you. I may just have to upfront then apologize because Wednesday morning I will be in. There is a cabinet presentation, and I'm occupied on also have a session already on Wednesday afternoon. So I will try my best. Otherwise, I will ask my colleague Joe Barner to present. Thank you.
No problem. I think what we'll do is between the procedural officer and myself, and I'll liaise with the programming chair as to what could be an appropriate time and date in order to deal with the extra presentation. But I do thank you for staying online and waiting patiently. And I do hope that you have a lovely day further with yourself as well as your team's delegation.
No, thank you. It was interesting discussion, the Mero. I mean the Pero and the Mero. Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much. HOD Savage, so you have the floor for the Mero. I'm going to ask that you just restrict yourself in terms of doing a complete deep dive, just so the members at least have one round of questions available. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Well, I won't waste any more time, and I'll hand directly over to Dr. Haberman's team, who's put this together, I think led by Mr. Boyson. Is that correct? Over to you.
Thank you, HOD. Yes, Mr. Boyson and Mr. Cronje will lead the presentation.
Malcolm, you're on mute. There you are.
All right. Thank you for the opportunity to present the 2021 Mero to the committee. It is obviously the 10th edition of the Mero. Let me just move my slides. We have then, as indicated earlier, we've got different chapters of the Mero to make it easier for the IDP officials and municipalities to engage with the document. Here we also wish to highlight just some of the infographics that's available to make it easier to engage with the document. In this specific regard, we have got the Central Karoo and also the trade situation of the West Coast district. Just in terms of the outline of the document comprised of two sections. Section A, which deals with transversal matters that affects each of the districts. And this has been extracted also from the Provincial Economic Review and Outlook. But then for the purpose of today, we're going to deal with Section B, which deals with the various regions. And within those various chapters, we've got the following chapters, which deals with the Regional Economic Review and Outlook, the sectoral growth, trade, tourism, and investment, and in the municipal socio-economic analysis. Then on this slide, we can see that the Cape Metro is the main contributor to the GDPR and employment in the province. The economic contribution of the Metro declined marginally from 71.5 to 70. Sorry, from 72% to 71.5% between 2019 and 2020. And we can also see that the West Coast District then gained in terms of its economic contribution. With regards to the employment contribution from the regional economies mimic that of the GDPR contribution. I think it's also very important, and just to point out that the Cape Metro's employment contribution is relatively smaller in terms of its economic contribution. Then with regards to the economic performance from 2012 to 22, which is the forecast period, we can see that the performance of the regional economies follow that of the national economy. On the slide, we've plotted occurrences such as load shedding, poor commodity prices, industrial strike action, and so forth. It's also then important to note the impact of the drought on the provincial economy. It's also important to note that from 2018 to 2019, the West Coast and the Central Karoo have already been contracting. Just in to illustrate the point of the deep contraction of the Cape Metro, as you can see, is 7.3%, and over there, versus that of the West Coast of minus 2.7%, and over there, that explain why there's those marginal shifts in the economic contribution of the West Coast and the Cape Metro. Just in terms of employment contribution, the employment trends follow a similar trend of the growth trajectory of the GDPR contributions, just following the aftermath of the financial crisis. We've had some deep losses here in terms of employment, but we've managed to done relatively well. But following the period of drought, we've basically not been able to create such major jobs, and we've got a deep contraction of almost 160,000 jobs in 2020. Then in terms of the sectoral contributions per region, we can see that the main contributors to GDPR includes finance, trade, and the manufacturing sectors. In terms of employment, it is trade, finance, community services, and agriculture, which are the main employers. The agricultural sector is of particular importance in many municipal areas, such is the case of the Berg River municipal area, where the sector contributes 50.4% to the employment in that particular area, and in the Cederberg region, where it contributes 42.3%. Also important to know that the agricultural sector is characterized by lower wages compared to other sectors, and this has an impact on other sectors and the ability of household spending and so forth. Then with regards to the average real growth over the period, we can see that the finance sector has performed particularly well, but our overall growth was dragged down by the agricultural sector due to the impact of the drought, resulting in this flat line growth that we've experienced over that particular period. Just to give a sense of the performance of the municipalities over that period, municipalities such as Witzenberg, Swellendam, and George recorded the highest growth, and that ranged between 1.5 and 2.2%. It's just the top three. Obviously, Swellendam and Witzenberg are small municipalities, and they grew from a small base, whereas George is a growing economic hub within the Southern Cape region. And then on the bottom three, there we look at Beaufort West, Knysna, and Laingsburg. And these municipalities have been affected by some sort of natural disasters. In the case of Knysna, the fires that have been experienced, and in Beaufort West and Laingsburg, the drought that had an impact on their growth performance. Then just for the immediate period, which is 2020, all municipalities were in negative territory, but the municipalities that performed well is Berg River, Cederberg, and Prince Albert. And then once again, the Cape Metro that performed the worst at negative 7.3%. Obviously, in the Cape Metro, Mossel Bay, and Stellenbosch, these areas that have contracted the most, issues such as alcohol and the travel bans had a particular negative impact on these municipal areas and surrounding coastal areas, which are popular as tourist destinations. Then just once again, in terms of the GDPR forecast and on a regional level, the Cape Metro contracted the most at 7.3%, while West Coast contracted at 2.7%. And in terms of the 2021, the regional economies are anticipated to recover particularly well, boosted by the strong agricultural commodity prices. The regional economies are also anticipated to recover between 3.5 and 5.1% in 2021, but then slightly lower at 0.5 and 3% in 2022. Just from the unemployment issues, obviously unemployment is a concern to us, and it is a problem that confronts the whole of the country. So the Overberg and the Cape Winelands municipal areas have the lowest unemployment rates compared to the other regions in the Western Cape. The Cape Metro and the Central Karoo are the extremes with the highest unemployment rates. In the case of the Metro, it obviously attracts more people in search of jobs, which leads to the high unemployment rate and also related social challenges. In the case of the Central Karoo, the high unemployment rate is mainly attributable to the result of a lack of economic diversification and due to the remoteness of the area. The decline in the unemployment rate in most of the regions between 2019 and 2020 is a direct result of decline in jobs available, and the proportion of non-economically active population has increased, specifically in specific areas such as the Central Karoo, where we can see it is at 50.5%. And obviously, this increased the dependency on those who are employed, and these areas, such as the CKD, are reliant on grants and remittances. Thank you. Then in terms of trade, in terms of 2020, the Western Cape exports were valued at 137 billion rand, while imports were valued at 196 billion rand. So we have maintained a trade deficit. Some of the main regional exports include agricultural produce such as citrus, apples, wine, and dairy products. The Cape Metro and the Cape Wineland regions contribute the most to the trade from the Western Cape, whereas trade from the Central Karoo as minimal. We spoke earlier about economic infrastructure, and in this regard, we just would like to highlight the fact that the importance of economic infrastructure such as the harbour and the Cape Town International Airport that supports trade for all regions in the province, and also our major national ports. Whilst the Cape Town International Airport is performed relatively well and receiving the highest accolades year on year, the same cannot be said about the Cape Town Harbour, and it is confronted by inefficiencies that deter our trade. Then, in terms of tourism, tourism activity in the province was significantly impacted by the restrictions imposed in 2020, with international arrivals reducing to zero between April and October. Arrivals in September and November in December 2020 were only fractional of the numbers recorded in 2018 and 2019. And in most regions, domestic tourists then sustained the main tourism markets in 2020, and that is mainly due to the closure of the national tourism. As such, job losses were incurred, and the domestic tourism was also likely negatively impacted, and tourism enterprises also recorded substantial declines in revenue. This also was also due to the fact of the beach closures in December 2020 that had a further negative impact on domestic tourism. Then with regards to the comparative advantages, and in this regard, I just would like to explain that the comparative advantage is when a region have score of 1 or above in terms of its relative output relative to the rest of the country. And in this regard, we can see the high comparative advantage with respect to agriculture for these regions, West Coast, Cape Winelands, Overberg in Central Karoo. In the case of the Cape Metro, it has a comparative advantage in manufacturing, construction, trade, transport, finance, and government sectors. This shows the diversity of the metro economy and its important role that it plays in the provincial economy. Most regions have a medium comparative advantage in the manufacturing sector. However, at the sub-sector level, there is a high comparative advantage, particularly in the food, beverage, and tobacco sectors. This obviously emphasized the importance of the agricultural value chain and the beneficiation activities that occur in the province. With regards to the Central Karoo, it has a high comparative advantage in electricity, gas, and water. And there is thus a potential to increase investments in renewable energy in that specific region. Then with regards to our socioeconomic indicators, 2020 was a particularly challenging year, specifically for the health and education sectors due to the COVID pandemic. We just want to highlight some of the issues here. The matric pass rates declined across all regions in 2020. But from a positive perspective, learner retention rates increased. Other positive indicators include the improvement in the Human Development Index across all regions. A positive issue is also the delivery rate to teenagers that have declined. Obviously, crime is a concern, but we've observed that it has declined across all regions, and that is mainly also due to the curfew restrictions and the restrictions on alcohol sales. Challenges includes the GDPR per capita that is on decline, and that obviously does not bode well for equality. Then lastly, just coming to the policy implications, I'm just going to ask Dian to do this part.
Thank you very Malcolm. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, colleagues and chairperson. I'm going to try to briefly wrap this up to give you a short summary in terms of what Mr. Boyson presented. Ultimately, as we mentioned, the intention with the MERO and the PERO and to a lesser extent our socioeconomic profiles is to inform integrated planning and budgeting. So just to quickly summarize some of the key implications, I think that the document this year through our research showed us that although the Western Cape population continues to grow, that towards the outer years, let's say towards 2025, that growth rate does slow to a certain extent. Now, population figures does influence all planning and budgeting efforts in terms of how you deliver your services and where and in what quality and quantity. So I think it's very important to just keep that in mind. Migratory patterns does obviously have a significant impact on these population growth figures, but at the moment the reliable data does remain limited. Quickly, in terms of household income and sustainability of local government, we think that just considering the constrained fiscal environment, that households continue to struggle and are unable to a certain extent to afford trading services. Now, those trading services is a key component, a key contributed to municipal-owned revenue, and that compounds the long-term financial sustainability challenges of local government. More households struggle, the more they must be classified as indigent. They receive goods, they receive services free of charge from the municipalities, who must already operate within a limited fiscal envelope. Malcolm and the HOD already indicated that we are rolling out the MERO almost in line with the joint district and metro approach. We just think to narrow down the information gives you a bit of a renewed focus at a district level. Then Malcolm did speak about the comparative advantages. I think the Western Cape, we have a significant comparative advantage in terms of food and beverages. That also offers significant scope and insight for private sector role players to see where they can invest and specifically in what districts. Unemployment rates, you can see that the rates did improve, but that should be taken within the broader context also to see that the labor force participation rate did decline or decrease, meaning that at face value, it looks like unemployment is improving, but more people are actually discouraged following the implications of COVID-19. I think that links very well, Chairperson, to the next bullet to say that amidst COVID-19, the self-employment ventures actually went up. A lot of people that were discouraged, they became entrepreneurs, they looked at own businesses and also increased the informal economic activity. And that necessitates obviously the need for us as a government to supplement and support, especially your SMMEs and your local business owners in rural communities. Then, Chairperson, very important also the demand for skilled labor. We see that more and more. There's the three cohorts in terms of general skills. You've got your skilled, your semi-skilled and your highly skilled workers. Now, continuously as we see the various sector mature, that and due to the extent of mechanization, etc., your demand for skilled labor is outpacing the demand for semi-skilled and unskilled labor. That means that it necessitates the need to upskill your lower skilled workers in order to be absorbed within the labor market. Now go to the next slide, please. I think there's one last slide. So infrastructure, I think that for us as a Western government, it remains important that infrastructure investment is and will always be a catalyst for broad-based economic growth, general development, as well as job creation. And I think that was significantly emphasized within the document itself. And also it strengthened the need to facilitate the establishment of funding and investment pipelines to address the various impediments that influence the completion of these various mega projects. In terms of service delivery models, there is a significant push also towards sustainable energy, renewable energy initiatives. So that does place a renewed focus on reviewing your current service delivery model, conventional service delivery models in terms of just charging service charges for the services provided. And COVID-19 emphasized the need for improved access to healthcare services. That's quite evident. And lastly, to wrap up, Chair, I think in terms of crime, we can see there was a general decline, mostly due to the lockdown measures implemented. So that should also be taken also with a pinch of salt. Ultimately, crime does remain an obstinate concern for us in the Western Cape, and that discourages investment and capital accumulation. And lastly, trade and tourism promotion increases local growth and employment prospects, which emphasizes, necessitates the need for destination marketing activities. And that is why we actually placed a dedicated focus for trade and tourism, a dedicated chapter rather, in the Mero for trade and tourism. That's it from my side. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you so much. HOD or Minister, is anything that you would like to add before I hand over to the members?
Nothing from my side. Thanks, Chair. Minister?
Nothing from my side. Thank you.
Okay, colleagues, I'm going to open up for one round of questions, and then what I will also do is I'll also engage with the programming authority as to whether we can unpack some of the respective topics and or district information in the beginning of next year as well. I do know that there are some topics that members also would like to explore from the previous Mero as well, so I will also then engage regarding that. I see Member Dugmore's hand. Any other hands? Okay, if none, Member Dugmore, you go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thanks to the officials for the presentation. Chairperson, you know, from the side of the ANC, we've raised when Pero and Mero were presented last year that these documents, you know, require a huge amount of research. They require a huge amount of expenditure as well from the provincial government. And one of the things that we're really looking at when we look at the issue of the state of our economy, especially how the different sectors are positioned in the different regions, including the metro, is to actually look at whether, in fact, we are beginning to transform the ownership patterns. You know, whether one talks about the transport industry, whether one talks about agriculture. We were told when we asked the question and we requested that this analysis actually includes the analysis of the ownership patterns in terms of particularly black ownership, and by black I mean coloured, African, Indian, and also gender. And once again, we have a document like this produced here, which talks about digital divides, but says absolutely nothing about race. If you look at the introduction and the list of you know, abbreviations, there's absolutely nothing about broad-based black economic empowerment. So if you're looking at the Winelands and you want to have make an analysis about whether any of these particular sectors, whether it be tourism or agriculture, is transforming in terms of ownership, you find absolutely nothing in this document. And I just want to ask, is this because there is actually an official policy that comes from the DA that race does not exist, and that all of these documents should not look through the lens of race, should not look through the lens of gender when it comes to actually understanding who owns the economy across our province? Because we asked for it, there was an indication when we asked that there would be a response to this, but this document actually tells us nothing about the transformation of this economy. And it appears to me that because there's an official policy of race denialism by the DA, that this particular MEC then gives an instruction to this department so that they don't analyze the issue of ownership of this provincial economy. What is the reason that the request from the ANC last year that this analysis should include ownership and pattern analysis of ownership patterns in regard to the different sectors, that it has not been included this year? What is the actual reason? Please be honest with us. Is this a political reason? Is there any other reason that our request has been ignored? Thank you.
Before I take the second hand, I'm just going to indicate that in terms of the questions regarding a political party's policies, unfortunately, because we are a committee of the Western Cape Provincial Parliament, that part we are unable to put to officials. However, I will allow your questions to the officials and the minister in the realm of government. So they are allowed to answer you in terms of the realm of government and how their policies work. However, as a committee of a provincial parliament, we cannot comment on a political party's policies. Thank you so much. Member Marais,
on a point of order, Chairperson. Point of order. Point of order, Chair.
Yes, I said yes. You may go ahead.
On a point of order, Chairperson.
Yes, Member Dugmore, I said you may go ahead with your point of order.
Point of order, Chair.
I don't think he can hear you, Chair, lady.
Colleagues, let me just put my video on quickly. I don't know if Member Dugmore can hear me because I did say that he can go forward with his point of order.
Okay, thank you.
But
I hear you now.
Can you hear
Chair,
me?
could you, yes, Chair, could you point out in which section of the rules that members are not allowed to ask questions of a political nature? We, for instance, know that the DA's policy is against the minimum wage of 3,500. Now, that is DA policy that they want 1,800. So show me, could you please indicate in the rules which indicate that we cannot ask questions of a political nature? Please refer to the rules.
Member Dugmore, I'm going to indicate to you what the difference is quickly.
No, I'm asking for the rules.
Member Dugmore, you have asked me a question. You need to now allow me to answer you.
Don't make up rules
Member
yourself.
Dugmore,
Show me the rules.
you have asked me a question. You need to now allow me to answer your question. It doesn't help you ask someone a question, but you don't allow them the opportunity to ask the question, answer the question you have asked. Okay, so allow me to please answer you. There's a big difference between asking a question of a political nature and asking a question based on a political party's policy. Okay, when you're asking someone, does the Democratic Alliance eat red apples in terms of their policy, compared to asking a question of political nature based on government and what government is supposed to be doing, or what you believe they are not doing correctly, or what you believe is not going well, and you would like to highlight, and it might be controversial. There's a big difference between those particular matters. Questions of political nature, of course, are allowed in this committee, and colleagues from various different political parties who often attend these meetings of the Budget Committee often frequently ask questions of a political nature. But what they do not do is ask questions on a political party's policy, which is specific to that political party. I've already indicated that I will allow your questions, which are of a political nature, but the parts that refer to a political party specifically and their specific policy, a government and a provincial parliament, which is independent and which is not supposed to be biased, we cannot speak to those. And I'm going to allow the Minister and the HOD to refer to those matters that refer to them specifically in this regard. And I hope you understand that, because there is a difference between questions of a political nature and questions about a specific political party's policy, which a government and a provincial parliament that's supposed to be independent cannot speak to.
Chairperson, sorry, on a point of order, I asked for which rule you are using to base this view of yours. Can you refer to the rule, please?
At the moment, I'm going to ask the procedural officer to just assist me, because I do believe that this goes against the very nature and mandate of independence of a provincial parliament. I will go on to Member Mare and Member Nkondlo, and I'm going to take the rest of your matters under advisement. Thank you so much. Member Mare.
Thank you. That is an interesting point, Member Dugmore has raised. I raised it before. The equity laws specifically mention who should be empowered, and it mentions the black as an umbrella name for colored people, Indians and Africans. So it is important that we know who's being empowered in job creation or benefits accruing to that policy of equitable share of the economy. So I also want to see, if they show numbers, I want to see numbers identified. Chair, the thing that we should realize is that the wealthy and the rich look futuristic. They look to a future. The poor, they look to the now. They don't look to the future. They don't have a future. They're hungry, without a job, without food, without education. They look to the now. They don't look to a future. For them, a future don't exist. So when we do our fiscal analysis, of fiscal policies, how it's to be split and shared, the benefits of fiscal policy, it's important for us to give the poor also a futuristic outlook. They want to know, what about the now? What are we getting now? So that is my contribution, and I agree that if we were in a different era of our metamorphosis, economically speaking, we can take away the race element, but for now we want it included so that I can report back to my constituency to say, what did I do to uplift them?
Thank you so much, Member Murray, Member Nkondlo, and then Member Wenger.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chair, I would like to ask the department, and perhaps the committee coordinator can indicate. The challenge at this point, once again, we do not have, I don't, and if it was sent, pardon me, because I'm trying to follow the presentation and I do not have the copy, nor the booklet of the Mero. And I know now, because we're operating remotely, we no longer have the benefit of having these books, you know, in our offices. So for me, it's important that, you know, in the spirit of transparency, you know, that the information is shared in this regard with the Mero in particular. And I want to ask, because I didn't hear, and that's why I'm saying, because I don't have a presentation, perhaps I might have missed it. I want to understand what happened to the socio-economic profile of the municipalities, which has been over the past couple of years. And actually, I started observing in the last Mero that this socio-economic chapter of the booklet was actually not as inclusive. I'm not sure if I'm using the right English word. Pardon me, English is my second language. But it's not as exhaustive as it used to be in previously. And I do not understand why. And because some of the issues, I think also the ones that are raised by both Member Dagmo and Member Mare, the socio-economic profile, including other sections that gives an indication of the economies of these municipalities, would actually start to tell you, you know, some kind of detail. Because remember, as people who are sitting at this level, indeed mandated by the constituencies, we need to get the granular information. We can't be discussing things at high level where the technical information is with the technocrats, and therefore we are only dependent on the information from their side. So I'm raising, and I'm not in any way casting aspersions. I want to understand whether that section in the booklet that I've not seen as yet, whether that section is still kept and it is as exhaustive as it was. And amongst others, one of the issues I would like to understand at this point from the previous one, what has been the Gini coefficient index of these municipalities, especially compounded by the reality of COVID. We know before COVID, Gini coefficient index, which is an international formula that calculates or measures inequality, you know, has been one of those indicators that would tell us the reality of these municipalities, where they had actually been almost close to one, which shows high levels of inequality that have been increasing year in and year out. So I'm trying to understand at this particular Mero, what is the inequality situation of these municipalities? And I'm raising it because I'm one person that have raised this. Also in 2019, this was further corroborated by the inequality report of Stats SA, in particular in as far as income inequality in the city of Cape Town, showing a very serious stuck income
gap, because the reason why this information and this data is important, it then, I fully agree with Member Mare, helps us as those that are mandated by the constituencies to actually understand the MTPPS that the minister has just been reading to us, and the extent to which indeed the financial resources of the state are actually targeted or directed to where, in Xhosa I would say, apho kufela ithole, to where it matters the most. Because at this point, we know for a fact, and the studies have proven that in particular COVID-19 have affected particularly those communities and households that have been vulnerable before. And one interest for me with the Mero is the fact that the Mero would provide you the granular detail and the data about such households, where they are concentrated, what exactly is the challenge. Further, it will even give you the education outcomes around that, the skills levels around that, so that the programs that were being mentioned by the good doctor around youth unemployment, one is able to juxtapose those interventions. And when we are directed to ask the various departments in standing committees, we ask intelligent questions. So I'm asking at this point, where is that information? How does that, and especially now we're coming from a local government where once again, these issues were amplified in all us as political parties that were contesting state power, where communities, in particular vulnerable communities, and actually including the middle class, there is also studies currently which are telling us how middle class or middle income earners in South Africa are shrinking. And it is important to understand that, because the economy we're being told about, you know, its growth or its challenges needs to be understood also in its subparts. And my view is always the subparts which are in the Mero are highly important to understand the information we get in as far as provincial economic outlook is concerned. So I'm just asking these questions, and I've already made the disclaimer that I do not have the copy of the presentation nor of the booklet, and I'm interested to know, and I'm asking the officials that may be sitting with the information and the minister to just clarify me in these particular issues which pertains to those that are vulnerable, and their vulnerability has been predisposed by COVID that we're sitting with at this point, where we end up with the very little fiscus have to intervene, you know, with extra money in this and the other, informed by those realities. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Member Wenger, I saw your hand went down. Do you still have a question?
Thank you, Chair.
No problem. I'm just quickly going to, before I allow for the HOD and the Minister to get to the respective questions. Firstly, Member Nkondlo, you must never say that you don't ask intelligent questions. You're one of the few members on this committee that are always assisting us with ensuring that we have robust debate. You are a member who always is proactive and assisting us with getting solutions, and the HOD and their team must answer your questions. That is how it works. I just want to give a little bit of feedback quickly before the Minister and the HOD continues. I'm going to read from the National Constitution of our Republic, the latest update naturally, section 114 relating to the powers of the provincial legislatures. I'm going to read in specifically subsection 2. Quote, a provincial legislature must provide for mechanisms A, to ensure that all provincial executive organs of state in the province are accountable to it, and B, and this is where I would like to read essentially in bold, quote, to maintain oversight of 1, Roman capital 1, the exercise of provincial executive authority in the province, including the implementation of legislation, and Roman capital 2, any provincial organ of state. And I would like to request that when we ask questions, that we stick to the mandate of the powers of provincial legislatures in terms of our national constitution. However, all of the questions I have heard subsequent to my previous indication are indeed in order, other than the fact that we don't refer to political party policies, but of course, your questions are allowed to be political in nature. And with that, I'm going to ask that the Minister and the HOD answer the respective questions that have been posed by the three members. Member Dugmore, I see your hand. Member Dugmore? Member Dugmore, you're on mute. I see a note here from Ms. Kluter as well, quickly.
Chairperson, you have, as I've indicated, you have not been able to provide this committee with any rule of this House. And in fact, you are censoring members of this committee if they, for instance, we all know the executive of this province is led by the DA. The DA policy informs what this executive does. So for you to argue that we cannot raise the question is actually a fundamental it's actually undermining our right to ask questions. I would like you to refer this matter to the Speaker, because it is the first time in the legislature that any chairperson is ruling that a question about a political party, particularly because this executive, as are the national executive and other provincial executives, are led by political parties. So for you to want to exclude a question about a political party's policy which might impact on the executive is simply a thumbsuck. And what you've quoted from the Constitution, you have not quoted from the rules, and I would like you please to refer this matter to the Speaker, because I think you have not provided the committee with what we have asked, what I have asked at least.
Mr. Member Dugmore, okay, I have received some advice from Ms. Kluter as well now. Despite there not being a specific rule in the Western Cape Provincial Parliament, as a chairperson, I'm under the understanding that I'm allowed to rule on this matter and that I'm allowed to not allow this particular question. Ms. Kluter has indicated that I'm also allowed to use Standing Rule 76 in this regard. However, I would like to remind you that the Western Cape Provincial Parliament rules is based on our provincial constitution, and that also must be in line with our national constitution. And our national constitution is the foundation of all laws in our country. I'm just going to quickly allow for Member Winger's hand, because I see that is up, before I continue with this matter.
Thank you very much, Chair. Maybe in order to assist, we have Rule 82 relating to chairpersons. You have then referenced Section 114, which deals with the powers of provincial legislatures. And in addition, you have made a ruling as the chairperson. And in terms of maintenance of order and discipline in committees, the generally accepted practice in Commonwealth jurisdictions, that is, if a chairperson considers a question to be improper or inadmissible, she may rule accordingly, and that ruling is then binding on that particular committee. And Chairperson, you have made that ruling, so I would then propose that that we continue.
Thank you so much. Member Winger, given the advice I have received from Ms. Kluter, just hang on.
In writing? Could that ruling be communicated in writing?
That is fine. All of our rulings, Member Dugmore, all of our rulings are noted also within our minutes. All of our rulings are also noted in our minutes, and should you believe that I'm not making the correct ruling, you are welcome to refer it to the Speaker. But it is my ruling based on the advice received from Ms. Kluter, who is a procedural officer, as well as based on the section within the National Constitution and the respective rules that I've quoted now, that this is improper. You are welcome to ask your questions that are of political nature, but not of a political party's policy, which is improper.
This is ridiculous. Honestly, this is ridiculous. Anyway, thanks.
Member Murray, I see your hand.
Yes, I just wanted clarity now. After your ruling, is my question, which I put. Now, I don't care who answers it, the minister, then it will be political, or the officials, then it will be politically neutral in a sense. But I just wanted to know whether they will in future report if they say so many jobs have been created in a certain sector in this time now that we are in, and there's such high unemployment among certain communities, if we can have a more broad analysis of the demographics which will be affected. Is that also not allowed, or is it allowed in terms of the rules? Because I would like an answer, please, as to if they can give me an analysis of the reports in terms of demographics.
Thank you, Member Marais. Member Marais, I can confirm there was nothing wrong with the questions you posed. Similarly, there was nothing wrong with the questions Member Nkondlo posed. Similarly, with 90% of the questions Member Dugmore posed, there was nothing wrong. However, the part about the political party policy, I am going to disallow. But questions of political nature, such as questions that you have asked today, which are some political in nature and some not, but they will be allowed because you're allowed to ask them. The questions, for example, that Member Nkondlo asked, she has a right to ask, and they were completely in order, and I'm also going to allow them. But I hope that assists you with an answer on that particular matter, Member Marais.
Thank you.
Member Bosman, I see your hand. I'm just quickly going to mute everyone in the background as well, just so I can hear Member Bosman clearly.
Chairperson, I just wanted to ask that you remind members to use the raise their hand function and wait for the chair to acknowledge them. It's very disruptive when Member Dugmore speaks over everybody else and just interrupts whenever it suits him. It's very difficult for us to follow the debate and the conversation when a member just interjects without observing the rules, which we've all agreed to, Chair. That's just my plea.
Thank you so much. I'm also going to just ask our procedural officer just to help us going forward in this regard. But with that, Minister and HOD, if you could please assist us with the answers.
Thank you, Chair. I will once again allow the HOD to go first, and then I will come in afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I mean, I'm not an expert on parliamentary rules of order, so that I completely follow all of that. But in terms of the substantive questions, I think that on the question from Member Dugmore on the ownership patterns of the economy, we did actually try to collect data on BBBE procurement and appointment data from municipalities to get a better insight into the ownership composition of local economies. But and we actually issued a circular in that regard as well. But uptake in terms of reporting in annual reports by municipalities has been quite slow. It's not unusual when you start to introduce the measures that it takes a little while for the data to get the coverage you need and then to get the quality that you need to be able to analyze it with any degree of veracity. So we did try in that respect. I don't think that we certainly haven't finished that journey in that respect. Where we are reporting on that information in terms of which gives us proxies for understanding ownership is in our procurement disclosure reports on an annual and a quarterly basis. We are now presenting, and we're aiming to expand that in terms of BBBE classification and so forth, and other designated groupings that are participating in our supply chains. But otherwise, the data is not really readily available. We are hoping that the next round of census data would assist us in that regard. What we are doing, and this perhaps comes more directly to Member Nkondlo's question on inequality data, we are reporting quite extensively on that, including on Gini coefficients. Yes, thank you, Mr. Boyson. So we're giving multi-year views on Gini coefficients by municipal area, not just at the district, but obviously for the district as a whole as well. Gini coefficients are one measure of inequality, so we're not limiting ourselves just to that measure. There are obviously many different measures, and those are discussed at some length in the report, because this was an issue, if you'll recall, last year that we talked about in quite some detail. So I think that there definitely has been an expansion in that regard. In terms of the overall trend, Member Nkondlo. I think what, as is in the main presentation, inequality has been rising across the board, at slightly different rates. And up to 2020, which is the last year of data that we have available, doesn't, I think, fully accommodate the effects of the pandemic and the recession that was part of that. So I think that these numbers, certainly for 2020, are somewhat partial still, and I think we probably would have seen an acceleration in levels of inequality. And that may well have reflected differently in different geographic areas as well. And hopefully, the individual reports give some sense of why resilience or inequality may be deeper and deepening faster in some areas as opposed to others, but it's often related to some of the other measures of inequality. So, for example, access to education or qualification levels, access to services, and so forth. In terms of the national trend, I mean and I think this is discussed in the PERO, if I'm not mistaken, is that the Western Cape is still not reflecting as being as unequal in terms of the Gini data as South Africa as a whole, but we certainly are normalizing, which is, I think, a very, very important public policy question. You also asked the question around our socioeconomic profiles, and as I mentioned in the beginning, I mean, we're certainly not stepping back from the socioeconomic profiles. What they do is they complement the MERO itself. So the MERO is taking a district focus that dives into municipalities. The socioeconomic profiles take that local municipality focus and pull that information together. And so 28 out of the 30 are already in full draft form and are out for consultation with the municipalities, with the local municipalities. So that we are far advanced on that process. It just comes one step after the MERO, but it'll certainly be concluded by the end of this year. It's what the team is actually working on now. Member Marais, in terms of the race-based data correlations in terms of service delivery, that is quite difficult at the local level. I understand. I mean, we can certainly look at how we present that data better going forward. I mean, we always listen very carefully to the comments and the needs of the committee and try and take them on board to the extent that the data allows. So we did try and go at the inequality data, and we did try and have a better go at, and I think somewhat successfully in that present, and we did try and go at some of the ownership data somewhat less successfully at this point. But I think that some of that is increasingly being picked up in what we're reporting in the procurement disclosure report. I don't think from the perspective of the department and the technical teams that we are told not to report on anything or analyze anything. I mean, we're led by the data availability and our ability to analyze it and make sense of data. And we are also led by the inputs and the feedback that we get, as in meetings like this. So it really is, from our perspective, without fear or favor. I've certainly never felt any pressure placed on me, and I don't think the team has, that I'm aware of. If anything, I think the pressure has been to say, let's get more information on understanding dynamics of inequality, dynamics of ownership, so that we can report on that and resource public debate on the issues. Minister, I'm not sure if I've covered that or if the team wanted to add anything else to what I've said. Because I know that they did struggle with a number of data challenges. Malcolm or Roy?
No, thank you, HD. I think you've covered it adequately. Where there's areas that the committee would like us to explore, we will obviously prioritize that going forward, where the data allows us to do so. Thanks.
Member Murray, I saw your hand quickly. I just wanted to check whether the HOD has answered the questions, or is that a follow-up or is that a point of order? Member Murray, are you able to hear me?
Thank you so much, Chair Lady. I just wanted to, if you allow me, respond to the reply I just received from Mr.
Murray,
David Savage.
Apologies, I don't want to interrupt you. I am cognizant of the fact that we are over 5 o'clock, and if you have a response to something that the HOD or the Minister has said, would it be possible for you to submit that to us so that we can send it to them for reply for you? Would that be assisting you in this regard?
It will assist, but I just wanted to make a statement, then a short statement, that in terms of the labour equity law, employers must report to the Commissioner. They have a plan, how they're going to apply the Act. And then they must report on progress made. That's what the Act says. So I can't accept a reply that it's difficult for you to compile such a report, because the Act says you must have such a report, because the National Minister wants to know and the Commissioner wants to know how far have the Western Cape gone with implementing equity. Am I correct or not?
Yeah, I'm going to ask Member Murray if we could put that question in writing then to the department for them to answer you in writing. Would that be in order for you?
That'll be in order for me, thank you.
Thank you, Member Murray. Member Nkondlo, I see your hand.
Chair, is the ruling that we submit questions, because I wanted to follow up on my question.
Okay, I did previously indicate that I'm only going to allow one round of questions on the Mero, and then ask that we have another session on Mero as well, with the assistance of the Programming Authority. I am going to ask that if you have any urgent or imminent questions, if we could please put those in writing to the department, if that's in order with you, Member Nkondlo.
I'll await the subsequent session you are referring to. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much. HOD, if there's anything else?
Chair, no, we're very happy to deal with questions either in writing or in in a follow-up session.
No problem. I will. In terms of a follow-up session, as I indicated previously, I will liaise with the Programming Authority. In terms of questions in writing, we will submit as received by members. Thank you so much. But colleagues, with that, I want to thank the Minister and the HOD and Team Finance for the comprehensive presentations they've made, on top of tabling extensive research and budgetary documentation. It's quite a feat, and we do appreciate the work and effort that goes into preparation and the presentation thereof. The committee will refer the respective documentation to the respective departmental committees for consideration accordingly, as we usually do on an annual basis. Thank you so much. I will now excuse you to go on with your daily matters if there's anything else that you still have to do after close of business.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the honourable members.
Thank you so much. Goodbye. I will then now just ask that members just please stay online so that we just deal with the reporting of the Mero. Given that we do not need to make decision on the Mero, we annually just report our deliberations on the Mero in general. Our procedural officer, Ms. Kamish Ahmed, has put together a draft report. I'm just going to ask her to put that up so that we can see whether there's anything that needs to be edited. And then I'm going to ask that we just hold over the committee minutes for the next budget meeting. I see Ms. Kluter is putting it up. Okay, let's just quickly make it bigger. Okay, let's take out the word draft at committee report. Okay, and let's take out, yes, thank you so much, and the capital R. Having considered outlook, can we just, change the reference there?
366 Lizette.
Okay, let's see, conclude, and then just the second reference as well, please. Okay, let's see here quickly. Okay, I think we've edited the necessary parts that we needed to edit. Ms. Kamish, Ahmed, Ms. Klutas, there's anything else do we need to edit?
Lizette, no, Chairperson.
Okay, and the other matters we usually put in our minutes anyway. Okay, colleagues, I would like to ask whether there is a proposer for the report. The report would indicate that we've convened on the 6th of December 2021, which is today, and that we've concluded deliberations on the matter which has been referred to us.
I will propose that we accept the report.
Thank you, Member Murray. I also see Member Philander's hand.
I second, Chairperson, that we adopt the report.
Thank you so much, Member Philander. Okay. In the absence of other views, the report is then so adopted. Given that we've asked now that the draft committee minutes just be held over, that was the draft committee minutes held on the 3rd of December, and I'm going to ask if members have any resolutions that we please submit to them in writing to the procedural officer, Ms. Kamish Ahmed, to her email. Members, I did check now, Ms. Simon and the Papers Office have this morning forwarded us the respective documentation via email at 10:58 regarding the respective budgetary documentation. And I think the only presentation is the summary of the MERO that I'll just ask Ms. Kamish Ahmed to make sure Provincial Treasury distributes to us. But with that, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for your robust debate and participation and engagement. It's always appreciated. And I hope you enjoy your week further with the engagement of the budgetary documentation. The meeting is thus adjourned. Thank you and goodbye.